Chapter 70. Merrin, 15. In the dusk light, the ships of Merrin's convoy were dark blots upon the blue seas. He leaned against the gunwale of his flagship, wind ruffling his cloak as he looked southward. To his eyes, the air current above was little different from the water below. His flagship left 2 wakes behind it, one in the air, one in the water. His arm still ached. Though he could find no visible marks, his hand had gone numb in the hours following his duels. He had begun to fear that it would remain that way, but a sharp prickling had awoken him that night, the first night at sea. Slowly, like a limb reawaking after being slept upon in the wrong position, sensation returned to his hand. Except rather than just the normal tingling, this reawakening had brought with it sharp pains. He hadn't been able to sleep that night. Fortunately, the pain had dulled. Only the ring of flesh around his wrist, the place where the bracelet had sat, continued to burn with any real pain. The rest of his arm just ached dully, like muscles overworked by spear training. Despite the pain, he had only lasted 2 days without the bracelet. It glistened on his wrist at that moment, gifting him with its strange powers. The winds ahead whispered to him as they parted for his ship, and he was tempted to do more than just watch. He wanted to feel as he had during that duel. Feel the wind cradling him, driving his swings and boosting his movements. The longing was odd, since it was accompanied by an acute memory of the flaring pain. How could he both crave the sensation and fear its agony at the same time? He resisted the impulse to call the wind to him. Not only did he worry about the pain and the damage it might do to his arm, but there was something more. He hadn't noticed it the first time he'd used the wind, but his second combat had done something to the bracelet. When he had taken it out after the 2-day hiatus, he had found the jade on the inside powdery and flaking. A good half of it had brushed away at his probing. Whatever he had done when he called the winds, it hadn't just hurt him, it had burned away the jade as well, just as it had when he had destroyed the glyph ward back on the night of the dueling competition. Merrin had been forced to have one of the Lochenron armorers rework the bracelet to fit the newly thinned stones so that they would still touch his skin when worn. The winds rustled behind him. "My lord?" a voice asked. "Yes?" Merrin asked, turning to find Calden standing respectfully, his new shard blade, still unbonded of course, resting on his shoulder. Since swearing his oath to Merrin, the soldier had taken it upon himself to be a liaison between Merrin and the Lochenron royalty. "The new scout reports have arrived, my lord," Calden said. "His Majesty has requested your presence at the debriefing." Merrin nodded, trying to ignore the worshipful glint in Calden's eyes. Merrin had incorrectly assumed that the impression would fade as time progressed. The young soldier still regarded Merrin with the same mixture of reverence and respect he had displayed on that first day. "You shouldn't blame the man," Merrin thought. "You probably spent your first weeks as a shard-bearer in a similar daze." The soldier's respect was discomforting nonetheless. "When?" Merrin asked. "Shortly, my lord," Calden said. "After the king finishes his meal." Merrin nodded, and Calden took the gesture as a dismissal, though Merrin would have preferred that the man stay. Merrin felt almost as alone as he had during his days of captivity. Renarin stayed locked in his quarters most of the time. Shinri always made Merrin feel guilty with those looks of hers, and the Lochenrons universally regarded him as some kind of divine hero. Since his failure to save Arador, and subsequent discussions with Renarin, had convinced Merrin of just how unheroic he was, the people's general regard made him feel deceitful somehow. Merrin sighed. This night's report would be like the others. He would sit quietly, not saying anything as the captain of the fast-moving scout ships relayed what his men had discovered from talking to villagers along the coast. Merrin's silence had a simple and practical motivation. He had nothing to add. What he knew of war came from a spearman's viewpoint and was of little use to macroscopic plannings. He had no experience with scouting, foraging, or planning assaults. Yet the other men in the conference, King Tamar, along with the other two former regents as his Parshans, and the collected Lachanran admirals and generals, always mistook Merrin's silence for thoughtfulness. When he did say something, they all nodded appreciatively, as if his single sentence contained truths beyond what normal men could comprehend. They always consulted him on decisions regarding the fleet, and even went so far as to ask his permission for minor course changes. Merrin sighed, turning to stroll down the left side of the ship. Port? Starboard? He thought that left meant port, but if he was wrong, no one had the courage to correct him. He walked undirectedly. The others always sent Calden's warning a good amount of time before the actual meeting began, so that Merrin would have time to prepare. Merrin probably had about an hour before he had to climb aboard one of the ferrying boats to be taken to the king's vessel. He found himself wandering toward the cabin area, past the rowing men, and up the steps to the central tier. He didn't go to his room, however, but paused in front of the one beside it, Renarin's chamber. He knocked. As usual, there was no answer. This time, however, Merrin wasn't in a mood to be dissuaded. He had to talk to someone who didn't look at him as some kind of heraldic savior. So he just opened the door. Renarin sat in a chair in front of the door, staring directly at him. Merrin jumped slightly. It soon became obvious, however, that Renarin wasn't looking at Merrin, but beyond him, his eyes thoughtful. "Come in and close the door," Renarin said quietly. Merrin entered the room, doing as instructed. The boat's frame creaked weightily as it rocked, but Merrin felt as if he had entered another world, one of strange, foreign markings. He had expected to see numbers on the walls. Renarin had been spending a lot of time in the room, after all, but seeing them still left Merrin with an eerie feeling. Renarin had carved his numbers directly into the wooden walls and floor, etching each one with a careful and precise hand. Thousands upon thousands of glyphs defaced the room, which Renarin had emptied of all furniture save for the single chair and some wrinkled bedding in the corner. The numbers were tiny this time, even smaller than the ones Renarin had drawn in his cell, and there were far more of them. There seemed to be a logic to them, one that Merrin couldn't quite apprehend. Some of the numbers moved in broad formations like marching armies, and others looked like they would form murals if one stood far enough away. All four walls were coated with scribbles, as was the entire floor. Only one section of the room was still clean, a circular place directly in the center of the door Merrin had entered through. "What do you see?" Merrin asked, stepping over to stand beside his friend's chair. "Questions," Renarin said. "Problems, wars. We live in strange times, Merrin." Wind seeped through cracks in the door. "I know," Merrin said truthfully. "I did as I wanted," Renarin said. "I looked at the larger tapestry. I looked at movements, not individuals. And I found myself horribly unprepared to do so. I don't have the answers I want, Merrin. I can almost see so many things, but the answers—" "I don't understand," Merrin said. "What do you see, Renarin? When I touch jade, the wind becomes real to me. It's like that for you?" "Kind of," Renarin said, still staring at the wall. "But not so clear. It mostly feels like I am given only a shadowed glimpse of the truths I want, a seductive taste. There is so much more that I can't see, but I fear to touch it." Merrin shook his head. "Fear? Why?" "Because it's so vast," Renarin said. "When I hold onyx, I feel like there's an immensity pressing against me, a force of incredible power, or of incredible information. The two feel very similar to me now." "A force?" Merrin asked. "Like the Almighty?" "Maybe," Renarin said. You see the winds when you hold that jade, but there is something more you can do, isn't there? You have a power beyond simply seeing, a power to affect and change." "Yes," Marin said with surprise. "How did you know?" "The histories speak of it," Renarin said. "When you change and direct the wind rather than just see it, you expend the jade somehow, don't you? Windrunners from the histories always needed a steady stream of jade to fuel their powers." Marin glanced at his wrist, then nodded in acknowledgement, though he wasn't certain if Renarin saw the gesture or not. "I think there's something more I can do too," Renarin said in a quiet, haunted voice. "A way to change, a way to find answers, a power greater than I see now, a way to do more than just guess at patterns, a way to see pure truth. When I hold my onyx, I can sense it, sense something calling to me, a luring call to seek the knowledge that waits just out of view." Renarin paused, looking up at Marin for the first time. His eyes were chilling. "I fear to do it, Marin," he whispered. "I fear what would happen to me if I seek those answers. In the histories, the seers never needed more onyx. They never expended it. I don't know why." Marin shivered. He glanced at Renarin's hand, which clutched his familiar shard of onyx, rubbing it with his finger, caressing it. "Don't do it," Marin said impulsively. "Whatever it is, Renarin, don't do it. These things we do, they're dangerous. We don't know enough about them." Renarin nodded. "The Apellion have been lost for too long. I still can't see what caused them to come back. It's too closely related to why they disappeared in the first place." "When I use my ability," Marin said confessionally, "something happens to me. When I really use it, not just see with it. It brings me pain, a sharp, burning agony in my skin where I touch the jade." "There must always be a cost, Marin," Renarin said. "Nothing is ever achieved without a cost being paid." "And my pain is that cost?" Marin asked. "No," Renarin said with an almost amused tone as he turned back toward the door. "No, the pain isn't the cost, Marin. It's just a side effect of the cost." Marin shifted uncomfortably. "Then what is the cost?" Renarin didn't answer. His eyes remained focused on the hole in his patterns. "Renarin?" Marin prodded. "I don't know, Marin," Renarin said, though Marin couldn't tell if he were speaking about this amorphous cost or about something completely different. "I don't know if I'll be able to resist. There are dangers coming, dangers that will affect everyone, not just us, not just kings and thrones. I saw hints of it when I worked in the cell, but this pattern, it shows me how ignorant I was. Though I tried to make my calculations for the broad scope, every avenue I try focuses me back toward a single event. That is the hole you see there, the one question that defies every permutation." Marin frowned, glancing toward the door. If he looked with a cocked head, it seemed like the hole in the writing were indeed a focal point of all the other patterns. Strings of numbers ran across walls through massive collections and patterns, only to end abruptly at this one central nothingness. "I can't find the answer," Renarin said. "Yet I need it. We need it. Without this, all of the different possibilities end the same." He stopped, then turned toward Marin and whispered a single question. "How do you kill a man who cannot die?" The room fell still. Marin felt a sudden apprehensiveness strike him, a desire to run and flee, to escape the chill unnaturalness of Renarin's cabin. Renarin turned away from him. "I need to start again," he decided. "I can find the answer. I have to. I'll need another room. Will you trade with me?" "And come sleep in here with all of these numbers staring at me? I'd sooner swim to Alethkar." "I'll arrange for you to get a new cabin," Marin said carefully. Renarin nodded distractedly, and Merrin fled the room. Suddenly, the discomfort of sitting through another scouting report seemed blessedly tame. Chapter 71. Taln 11. Taln could still hear the men riding away from him in terror, screaming as the waters roared toward them. He had done what he could to save them, trying so hard to scare them into deserting or retreating. Their commanders had been stubborn, however. At first, they had been determined to continue on toward Yasna's army. Eventually, their determination had instead become focused on finding the man who had killed their guards and scouts. They should have been frightened away. A lesser army would have been. However, it appeared that the descendants of the epic kingdom of Vedenar retained their ancestors' discipline and militaristic zealousness. They had always held such notions, even at their foundation so long ago in the city then called Su'ur. And so they had continued onward. True, some had fled, but not as many as Taln would have wished. Even after the desertions, even after he himself had killed a good 50 of their number, they had still been strong enough to crush Yasna's untrained force. He closed his eyes, trying not to think of the rushing waters, the high storm flood crashing through the narrow canyon. He'd killed their scouts. They hadn't known how small and high-walled the fissure would become. They were tired, slow to react. They had marched after him, the entire army, since none were willing to go alone, once he had revealed himself as if by accident, as if caught by their trap. Instead, he had led them to a trap of his own. Men screamed in his memory, screamed as they were pulled beneath the waves, the powerful current smashing them against rocks. Man had always been a limp puppet before the powers of nature, and such was even more true here on Roshar, where the high storms were so stark. 800 men, dead as Taln watched, holding to his shard blade with slick hands, the weapon jammed at an angle into the stone wall to give him purchase. He should have died. A regular man probably would have, but he had felt the presence of his brethren pulsing through his blade. He had to find them. The army had left some of its spare mounts at the entrance to the canyon. And the Awakener. Well, Taln had been surprised to find the creature alive, sitting complacently at the bottom of the canyon once the waters receded. But Awakeners rarely acted as expected. Prael and Balear were far more learned Lonamists than Taln. They might have been able to give an explanation. Taln had never understood awakening very well, even when he did it himself. He opened his eyes with a sigh. He rode at the head of the re-inspired army beside Yasna and Meridas. With them rode 5 new shard-bearers, men who had received the weapons Taln had gathered from the fallen Vaden soldiers. He had awarded 3 of the blades to Yasna's guards, then grudgingly given the last 2 to Meridas's nobleman attendants. The men were the only others in the army who had any real dueling experience. If Meridas had been surprised by Taln's return, he had not revealed it. Already warned by the festivities, Meridas had received Taln like a monarch welcoming a returning hero. To do anything else would have revealed him as petty and jealous. He had accepted Taln's gift of the shard blades as if given to himself, in fact, as if they had been expected. Taln had left that night less certain of his ability to regain control of the army. Regardless of its leader, however, the army marched under Taln's name. They walked behind, proud and reassured that they had made the right decision in joining him. The believers felt vindicated. The disbelievers were more inclined to listen to his warnings. Neither group would ever truly know what he had done for them, never understand what it cost. He should never be forced to kill men. Yet their herald had returned. Their devotion was too close to worship, he knew. He had rebuked the prophet who had claimed to preach in Taln's name, but such a man was more a symptom than a problem. Still, for the moment, Taln did nothing about their devotion. There would be time to teach correct truths once he was certain that mankind was prepared to face the challenge that lay ahead. With 3,000 years of life behind him, it was rare for Taln to feel impatience. Yet he had felt a remarkable amount of anticipation as they rode that day, the army's speed seeming frustratingly lethargic. His brethren waited just a short distance ahead. Once he found them, everything would be all right. They would know what to do. Finally, the army crested a hillside and looked down at the ruins of what had once been Joravan, the holy city. Taln despaired to see what had become of its beauty. Once it had been one of the 3 most magnificent cities in Roshar, a monument to the Almighty and his worship. Now only rubble remained of its fine metals and polished marble. Instead of alabaster, the city was a dull gray. Its massive streets, once lined with statues, were broken and weathered. Its careful architecture was grown over with moss-like cromstone, the patina gift of 1,000 high storms. An army waited in front of the city. It was easily 3,000 in number, and its men were well equipped. Metal armors shone in the sunlight, and there were even 2 archer-filled towers. "At least we hold the short-blade edge," Meridas noted, studying the field. "We needn't go to arms against them," Taln said, nodding toward the already constructed parley tent. "This is not an enemy army, but a force gathered by my brethren." Meridas rolled his eyes toward one of his attendants, who smiled at the gesture. Yasna held up a hand before any banter could ensue. "I will speak for us," she said, "and do the negotiations. You 2 will remain silent, both of you." Taln frowned, an action mimicked by Meridas. "A woman cannot—" Meridas began. Yasna quieted him with a stare. She had given her order, and they were both sworn to obey. "Kemnar, choose 20 men to join us as an honor guard. Leave the army in Vinda's command. He, with the other 4 shard-bearers, are to remain here. In case of a trap, I don't want all of our blades in one place." She kicked her horse into motion, and they followed, Meridas frowning at the necessity of leaving his 2 attendants behind. As they approached, Taln was able to make out a man waiting beneath the parley canopy. He sat at the table, his posture unconcerned. This was a man who understood that he clearly held the advantage. Lord Aniezer was a gruff-looking man with a wild mane of graying hair. He wore a full beard, also gray, and utilitarian clothing. He looked more like some crazy hermit than he did a military commander, or at least he did until one looked into his eyes. They were solid, the eyes of a man who yielded little and suffered no foolishness. Yasna dismounted. She had composed herself from the previous night's storm-filled oddity and again wore her practiced political face, her hair done up with perfection, her motions graceful and controlled. Taln and Meridas dismounted as well, walking beside her. There was only 1 seat on their side of the table, and Yasna took it without hesitation. Taln entered the shade of the canopy, searching among Lord Aniezer's companions. They were hardened warriors in metal and leather, and not a one was familiar. Taln touched the hilt of his blade, feeling for his brethren. They still waited ahead, in the city. "Who is the herald?" Aniezer asked bluntly, and Taln smiled. His brethren had warned of his approach. Yasna didn't betray surprise. "That is him," she said, nodding toward Taln. Aniezer studied Taln for a moment. "You could have found someone who looked a bit more heroic," he said. "This man is burly, but hardly the pretty face people expect from a herald." Taln frowned, but Yasna continued without pause. "He was the best man for the position," she said. "He can make others believe in him." Aniezer grunted. "I guess that is what matters." He eyed Yasna. "You have the look of a Kholin.
Raising troops, I assume. But for which army and which king?
Jasnah betrayed none of the confusion Taln felt. Does my position matter to you?
It does if you have sided with the loser instead of the victor, Eliezer said with a grunt. So which is it, Jasnah Kholin? Which do you follow, your brother or your uncle?
I no longer support my brother's right to the throne, Jasnah said smoothly. Though she was undoubtedly as lost as Taln, she seemed confident, as if she were the one holding the advantage, and Eliezer the one who needed to bargain. Taln had heard of her political savvy, her uncanny ability to dominate a court, but he had rarely seen it applied. She had always been more open with him, though he suspected that was because she saw nothing to gain from him, rather than because she felt more familiar with him.
I should like to fight at the side of the tyrant Bane,
Eliezer noted, rubbing his bearded chin in thought. It will not be that simple, Jasnah said with a disapproving tone. I have heard of the way you treat the people in this area. You are a despot.
Eliezer shrugged. The difference between a thug and a king is nothing more than a royal banner glyph. If a man acts in his own name, he is a tyrant. If he acts in the name of the kingdom, he is hailed as monarch. This is a harsh land, Lady Kholin, and it needs a harsh ruler. I have brought peace, if not ease, to their lives.
Jasnah frowned thoughtfully. I would be willing to look past your deficiencies, I suppose. Eliezer laughed, leaning back in his chair.
By the winds, woman, you have gall. I could destroy your little army right here. Don't think you're the first person to think of using a herald to try gathering troops in Rimac. I've destroyed half a 10 such armies in my lifetime, slaughtering the false heralds who ran them. I will suffer no instability here in Rimac. Either we make an agreement, or I will destroy you right here.
Then let us deal, Jasnah said, not looking at all intimidated. But let me assure you, Lord Eliezer, if we fail to agree, then I will leave here safely. Do not think that my uncle will not exact retribution upon you simply because you hide here in the wilds.
Eliezer frowned slightly. You are certain he will win, then? He asked. Your brother has the legitimacy of the crown.
My uncle is a far better warrior, Jasnah said dismissively, and he has the loyalty of the people. But things have changed. Both brother and uncle have another foe to worry about. Eliezer's frown deepened. Vedenar has invaded, Jasnah explained.
Ah, Eliezer said. I had wondered why you had come to Rimac for mercenaries when Alethkar has always been so proud to fight with only its own men. But weakened by civil war...
So let us dispense with threats, Eliezer, Jasnah said. Will I return to Alethkar with your aid, or will I go alone?
That depends on whether or not you'll pay my price, Eliezer said.
Name it, Jasnah said. But know that I, of course, carry no chips with me. You and I shall make a standard mercenary contract, to be paid after the war is finished or once 1 year passes, whichever comes first.
Ah, but I have little need of more gems, Eliezer said. I only end up giving them back to your country or others buying the supplies I need to stay safe. No, I need something a little bit more permanent than what is offered in standard mercenary contracts.
Jasnah's eyes thinned. What? Eliezer leaned forward.
Legitimacy, he said. 900 years ago, your oath-shard king conquered Rimac. You destroyed the kingdom's infrastructure and subjugated its people. Then, when Prala threatened your border 2 centuries later, you simply left. Your people claimed Rimac, then abandoned its people to despots, squabblings, and raids from the barbarian Kavanars. You destroyed a proud kingdom. Well, I want you to take it back."
He waved to an attendant who pulled out a map and spread it on the table. It was a very detailed representation of Alethkar and Rimac. The aging Aniezer looked over it eagerly, standing and pointing at a line drawn from Alethkar's border to the Holy City and back down to the south.
"You see," he said, "with this perimeter you could easily form a defensible border within Rimac. It would make the Holy City and all of the towns I control part of Alethkar, as well as give your kingdom direct access to the northern mines."
Jasnah studied the map. Then, showing the first hint of emotion since the negotiations had begun, she looked up at Aniezer's face. "You really aren't a tyrant."
"Ha!" he said. "Of course I am. But I'm one who is wind-cursed tired of fighting every bandit who tries to steal my place. I'm getting too old to worry about mutiny and rebellion. I'll let Aleth troops into my city. I'll even give up control of the Oathgate, as long as you name me as an independent lord with no tribute."
Jasnah looked down at the map, smiling slightly. "My brother spent 3 years trying to conquer Prala," she said. "I wonder how he would have responded if he had known that Rimac was simply waiting to let us take it."
Aniezer snorted.
"Very well, then," she said, rising. "I see no reason why your price cannot be accommodated. You'll have to get final agreement from my brother first, of course."
"Or your uncle," Aniezer said, "depending on which one still lives. Very well. My men are ready to march. When do we leave?"
Taln stepped forward.
"As soon as you show me to my brethren,"
he said, eliciting a faint frown of displeasure from Jasnah. Aniezer looked toward her with a frown. "Lord Aniezer," Jasnah said, "have any other false heralds come to Joravan recently?"
"No," Aniezer said with confusion. "What is this about?"
Taln turned, walking back to his horse.
"I'm riding into the city," he said. "Follow if you wish, but do not try to stop me."
Chapter 72. Jasnah, 16. Jasnah cursed to herself quietly, riding behind the galloping Taln toward the holy city of Joravan. Lord Aniezer followed behind, looking very troubled. Their alliance was tenuous, their armies still poised to attack one another. "If you ruin this, madman," she thought threateningly. Aniezer's willingness to join with her, at the simple price of allowing himself to be conquered, was an unforeseen and remarkable boon. His men were obviously well trained, and were numerous enough to be a great help to her brother. During the negotiations, it had been all she could do to keep herself from gasping at her remarkable good fortune. If Aniezer had known how desperate they were, that they had not come to recruit him, but had arrived by happenstance. She didn't even want to think about her brother and Dalinar being at war. What could have convinced her stoic uncle to start a civil war? Her brother must have done something terrible indeed. Either that, or Dalinar had discovered Elhokar's ruse to frame Jezenrosh. Either way, she had to get back before King Avan destroyed them both. And Taln's recklessness was threatening it all. Unfortunately, there was little she could do beyond follow him, trying to catch up. Behind, she could hear Meridas explaining about Taln's madness to Aniezer. The despot fortunately accepted the explanation, chuckling as he praised Jasnah for finding an actual lunatic to be her false herald. The ease with which he accepted her willingness to deceive people in order to gather troops was chilling, especially since she knew he was absolutely correct in his assumption. Aniezer was a harsh man, but men worse than he had made good leaders. She knew Elhokar would have no trouble granting Aniezer a title, for the move would give Alethkar control of the Rimac garnet mines. Dalinar might have more trouble accepting the despot, but he would feel bound by Jasnah's promise. Those eventualities, however, assumed that either one still lived. Jasnah sighed, urging her horse faster. Ahead, Taln had slowed as he entered the city itself. He had his shard blade out, and he paused for a moment, holding it. Then he took off again, guiding his horse across shattered streets and around fallen statues. Jasnah followed, as did Aniezer, Meridas, and both honor guards. The holy city itself, what little she was able to see of it as she rode past, wasn't very impressive. Most of it was covered with cromstone, leaving whatever details had been left in the rubble covered with a thick rock skin. It was like a city melted, an area filled with giant waxy lumps. A few buildings still stood, however, and Taln made for one of these. She caught up to him as he reached a large pillared structure that betrayed very little decay, all things considered. "Taln!" she called, but he ignored her, swinging off his horse and rushing into the building. She cursed, climbing off her beast with a less adroit scramble, then followed him into the building. The inside was dark and smelled of old stone. Though cromstone coated windows and piled at their bases, most of the enormous hallway still stood intact. Ornate pillars disappeared into the depths above, and massive marble blocks made up the floor stones. The hallway had been stripped of anything worth carrying, but a few broken statues stood at its ends, their shattered faces staring through sunlit, dusty air. Taln's footsteps echoed from in front of her. She dashed behind him, her masculinely cut clothing letting her move far more quickly than her usual courtly shuffle. She was puffing by the time she reached the end of the large corridor. A room rose around her, as grand in proportion as the hallway that led to it. It had also been robbed of finery, but its dominant features still stood untouched. 10 enormous statues stood along the walls of the circular chamber, their height making her gape in amazement. She had heard stories of the legendary Elin Shenton, one of the wonders of epic kingdom glory. She hadn't realized the magnificent statues still stood. She recognized each one, of course. She had been trained in Vorin teachings as a child. Baliar's Soul Song, the Timeless, Jezrion's Storm Rider, the King, Vadal Key Watcher, the Else Smith, Nail's Sun Eyes, the Just, Shalessa Ashmaker, the Scatterer, Kavazaran Lightcall, the Healer, Prael Smokewish, the Discerning, Chanaral Bond Seal, the Maker, Ishar Holy Dawn, the Sacred, and Talanel Stone Sinew, the Steadfast. Taln stood in the cavernous room staring up at the statues as if in a trance. Then he looked down at his shard blade. Taln fell to his knees and plunged his blade into the stone at his feet. She could hear his harsh breathing as if he were weeping, but there were no tears. The others arrived a few moments later, and Meridas made to step forward, but Jasnah held out a hand to stop him. They stood in silence, watching Taln attack the ground with a random vengeance, muttering to himself, his blade throwing up chunks of stone as he worked. Jasnah could see the wildness in his eyes, the confusion, the despair, and the danger. This was not a time to confront him. Perhaps he's finally realized the truth, she thought, though seeing his tortured face, she could find no joy in the concept. He's been forced to admit his delusions. What if he couldn't accept the truth? What if his mind snapped? His echoing mumbles gave her a chill. What if she had destroyed him by bringing him here? Would not the delusional but functional Taln be better than a man who had broken? She cursed her own lack of sensitivity. She should have tried to help him, should have led him away from Joravan and the confrontation it represented. Instead, she had come eagerly, anticipating the satisfaction of proving herself right and Taln wrong. Her heart broke with his at the empty room. Suddenly, she didn't want him to know, didn't want him to have to be disappointed. Ahead, Taln stopped digging. He knelt in the hole he had dug with his maddened swinging. Chunks of stone gathered around the lip. His head was barely visible over the rubble. She approached quietly. "Taln?" she asked. When he looked up, she didn't see the madness or the frenzy she had expected. Instead, she saw only confused, tired grief. Taln stood and slammed his shard blade into the stone before her. Except it wasn't his blade. He held his own weapon beside him. The new blade was beautiful and ornate, not a blank, but a blade with swirling designs, like the fringes of curling mist. Taln looked down at the new sword with wearied eyes. "It was Jezrien's," he said with a haunted voice. "I can feel the other 8 buried here as well." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "My brethren are dead. This time, mankind must face the Hothan alone." "They appear to be tombs of some sort, my lady," Kemnar said. They stood at the mouth of the massive chamber. Men worked inside, cutting with shard blades to search for any further prizes hiding beneath the stone. The passage slopes downward, and so the rainwater that got through the hallway windows here would have pooled in the statue chamber. The crom stone there is dense, several feet thick. It appears that there were 10 caskets set into the floor's brickwork. 9 of them had blades in them. 1 was empty. "The empty one," Jasnah said. "How did he get the blade out?" "There were a lot of cracks in the floor," Kemnar said. "From a quake or other disturbance. Most of the sarcophagi were broken as well. We didn't look too hard before we began cutting, but it's possible one of the cracks went all the way down to the blade chamber. Anyway, the swords have been here a long, long time, probably since the Epic Kingdoms, most definitely since before Rimac fell. It would take centuries for this much cromstone to build up." Jasnah nodded. Taln sat inside the room, watching the work with dull eyes. Meridas and Aniezer stood at the side, supervising. She clenched her jaw as she saw them. She hadn't been paying enough attention to Meridas since the discovery. He was already becoming too close to the despot lord for her tastes. "These blades are strange, my lady," Kemnar noted, drawing her attention again. "None of their opals are black, yet they hold their forms anyway. They should have reverted to blanks long ago. They change like any other blade if we put a bonded opal in them, but there's still something odd about them." Jasnah nodded. "Knock all of the clear opals off, but keep a hold of them. And keep digging. There might be more blades to be found." Kemnar nodded. "It isn't likely we'll find more, though. None of us can feel whatever it is that Taln claims lets him sense the blades. And we've already dug up the 8 he said were here." "Keep going anyway," Jasnah requested, leaving Kemnar behind and walking over to join Meridas and Aniezer. The despot lord regarded the excavation with troubled eyes, obviously uncertain how to react. He had been sitting on one of the greatest treasure finds in the history of modern Roshar, and never known it. 9 shard blades. A man could have found mythic Lura itself and not been so well rewarded. "As a token of goodwill, Lord Aniezer," Jasnah said, "I grant you half of the blades we have discovered. Find 4 good men to bear them." The wild-haired man regarded her through narrowed eyes. "Yes, Aniezer," Jasnah said in a suffering tone. "I know you could kill us and take all of them for yourself. But what would that really gain you? Our several positions have not changed since our negotiations, and you still want membership in Alethkar. If you do become a lord, you will have to grow accustomed to the fact that you have superiors, if just a few of them. Sometimes they will make decisions you don't agree with. Part of having a title is honoring it, following your betters even when you are dissatisfied. Eleazar regarded her for a moment longer, then smiled. "You are an impressive woman, Lady Yasna," he finally decided. "I see why Lord Meridas chose you to be his bride." "Lord Meridas did not choose me," Yasna corrected. "That is something else you'll have to accustom yourself to. In civilized lands, women arrange the marriages. Learn quickly, I suggest, since I hear that you are unwed. The court women won't long let a powerful lord such as yourself go unmatched, and you will need heirs." Eleazar shrugged. "I have heirs," he said. "Just no wife to go with them." "You'll need legitimate heirs, Lord Eleazar," Yasna said. "You are an Aleth nobleman now. You will need to learn to act like one." Eleazar just smiled again. Yasna left him, picking her way through the rubbled room and around the exhumed sarcophagi to where Taln sat alone at the feet of a massive statue. "Taln?" she asked gently, kneeling beside him. He sighed deeply. He had been despondent since the discovery earlier in the day. Night was quickly approaching now, and the men worked by lantern light. "Something has gone very wrong, Yasna," he said softly. "I've known it since the return began. The failure of the sign, the unresponsiveness of my Na'el bond, my missing powers, and now my brethren. They're connected, all of these problems. Something went wrong 1,000 years ago, but I wasn't there to see what. I died too early." "Taln, you're not dead," she said. "You're right here." Taln shook his head. "We all die, every time, Yasna. Either we die at Hothan hands or our own. We can't stay in this world, not for very long. Sometimes we can remain for several decades, but we always have to go eventually. There are reasons we cannot be here. I died early last time, defending the keep of Velatal, as your legends explain. I often die early, since I do the most fighting. Regardless, I never saw the end of the return last time. Something must have happened after I died. The book I took from your library, it claims that the Elin declared the cycle of returns broken. I don't believe that is possible. Even if it were, I would be dead right now." He paused, nodding toward the room before them. "This was a place of men. We never asked for it, but they built it anyway, to put our bodies in each return after we died." "But," Yasna said, "there aren't any bodies in the caskets. No bones or anything. Just the blades." Taln shook his head. "There wouldn't be bodies," he said. "When heralds die, their bodies turn into smoke after a time. The songs teach of that, do they not?" Songs she had always thought of, and still thought of, as silly. Still, he had his mythology right. "Look, maybe you're overreacting," she said. "Perhaps they're not dead. Maybe they just never came to get their swords." She couldn't believe what she was saying, that she was feeding his delusions so. But if it brought back the Taln she knew— "No," Taln said. "It doesn't work that way. When we are reborn in the other world, our blades come to us. That is what the opals are for. The summoning and dismissing of blades is an improvement mankind devised. When a herald dies, his blade goes with him to the next world. When he returns, it comes to Roshar with him. How do you think I got my blade back when I returned?" And you didn't know the blades allowed you to sense only where the other blades were? Not where the other heralds were? Jasnah asked. Taln shook his head. You'd think that would come up over the centuries, but it didn't. We are never without our blades, Jasnah. That's the other reason I know that my brethren didn't abandon them here. Our powers are tied to our swords. They are part of us. We don't just leave them behind. You say that the heralds never leave their blades behind. Yet here they are, Jasnah said. You claim the blades go with them when they die, but they haven't. So they can't either be alive or dead. Don't you see how circular this is? Taln nodded. And that is what has me confused. Like I said before, something must have happened at the end of the last return. I was the first to die. If something happened to the Na'el bond after I left, perhaps, I don't know. Maybe my brethren aren't in either world. Maybe they really are dead. Killed somehow. Permanently. And this, she sensed, was what made him so depressed. He had worked through it all on his own already. He had arrived at the same double dead end, and worried that the other heralds, men he knew of only in his delusions, but who were real to him nonetheless, were all dead. Wouldn't you have seen them in the dwelling? Jasnah said. During the times between returns? Didn't you ever wonder what happened to them? Taln shook his head. Things are complicated on the other side, Jasnah. I wouldn't have known if they came back or not. I assumed that they did, but I don't know. He turned toward her, haunted. I'm the only one left. Even if they are alive somewhere, I'm the only one who came for this return. Mankind only has me. They needed brilliant, intelligent leaders, but they received only Talinel. This time Jasnah spoke honestly. Taln, you do yourself injustice. What do you think you are? An idiot of some sort? You've a clever mind, far more intelligent than most of the men I've known. Why must you insist on self-deprecation? No self-deprecation, Jasnah, Taln said. Just truth. 3,000 years has taught me some things, but the others, they are brilliant, Jasnah. Ishar wrote all 10 arguments and founded a religion. Chanaral designed the Oath Gates and the Shard Blades. Bajordan wrote The Way of Kings primarily based on the things he learned from Jezrien. Nail gave the Su'ur their code, which became the standard of law throughout Roshar. The others weren't just men, but geniuses, every one. Listen to their names. Lightcall, Discerning, Holy Dawn, Timeless. What am I? Talinel, the Steadfast. That's what I've always been. Reliable and stalwart, but not a leader. I'm no man of great wisdom. I'm just a warrior. That's why I was so eager to come find the others. They know what to do, how to organize mankind. Without them... Self-pity will serve you nothing, Taln, Jasnah said. You're too quick to judge. Maybe the others left their swords here for good reason. Maybe they never died last time. Maybe they're still out there somewhere. You haven't really looked yet. They may not even know you're back. Taln sighed. It is not self-pity I feel, Jasnah. 3 millennia have helped me learn to avoid sullenness. However, the time has also taught me a few things about the Hothen. The odds are not good. We have 1 herald instead of 10, and the few people who have come to know me best since the return began still think I am insane. One cannot consider such difficult events without some measure of sorrow. She wasn't sure how to respond to that. Taln, she said, come back with me. Come to Alethkar and forget about your failure. It doesn't matter. Forget about your insanity. It wasn't that easy. Instead, she asked, "Do you intend to continue with us?" He shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "I will have to consider it. Things are troubling." She didn't press him, though she wanted to. It wasn't her place. Hers was in Alethkar, in a union that brought her power. Icy, comfortless power, with the snide man who stood on the other side of the room, watching her and Taln with the unveiled rage of jealousy. So she left Taln sitting in the room, below the statue of a massive, muscular man with a chiseled face and heroic expression. Taln the man, sitting at the feet of Tollinel, the legend. The aggregate army left Joravan the next morning. Aniezer was impressed to discover that they had an awakener, and it seemed to increase their standing with him. He offered to share some of his equipment with Jasnah's men, and she accepted gratefully, though she suspected Meridas had something to do with the offer. Either way, Aniezer saw that each of her men at least had a spear, if not a metal cap, and leather jerkin. There were even some shields to spread around. The Despot Lord and Meridas rode together, and Jasnah had trouble thinking of a reason to command otherwise. Still, she was suspicious of Meridas's motives. If Elhokar and Dalinar really had gone to war, she had little doubt as to which side Meridas would be on. That put him and her at odds even more soundly, since she would back Dalinar in the conflict. However, for the moment there was a greater threat. She could only hope that her uncle and brother had realized that fact, and now resisted the invaders together. Taln rode alone, rebuffing even Lan's attempts at conversation. He didn't leave the army, though Jasnah still feared that he might. When asked directly, he implied that he hadn't decided whether to help her in Alethkar or not, claiming that the disputes of nations were none of his concern. The army was still vaguely under Taln's banner, though Aniezer's troops were not religious zealots, but instead battle-hardened soldiers. Aniezer himself had agreed to visibly accept Taln's claim as a herald. This didn't change many of his men's attitudes. They followed because they believed that their lives would improve greatly once they were accepted as Aleth's citizens, but it did give a strong measure of legitimacy to Jasnah's recruitment efforts. In addition, the more believing part of Jasnah's forces were quick to tell stories of how Taln had singly defeated 1,000 men and had saved so many in Ral Aram. Slowly, his reputation even with Aniezer's soldiers began to swell. Jasnah now had two methods of persuading men to join her banner. They could either come to fight for the herald they had heard rumors of, or they could join in the hopes of earning a higher citizen rank when Aniezer's cities were folded into Alethkar. The combined prongs aided them greatly in gathering forces, especially in Aniezer's tribute cities. Soon, their army was approaching 6,000 in number, and Shale, their awakener, had to work constantly to provide grain to supplement what they could get from trade and foraging. Despite her success in recruitment, however, Jasnah rode with frustration. She worried for Alethkar. If Elhokar and Dalinar had gone to war over the throne, then King Avan could have exploited their weakness, taking both armies when they were already fatigued. Most of the cities in Alethkar would be undefended, and supplies would be scarce. She worried about the people she knew. Who of her family still lived? What of Dalinar's sons? Did Alethkar even still stand? Or was she bringing her army to the certain death of a conquered kingdom? Taln worried her as well. Despite his noble words about avoiding sullenness, he looked like he was doing a fair job of moping. She didn't know if it was because he thought his herald's dead, or if there was a deeper reason, one derived from his failure to prove his delusions. Perhaps this was the time to press him, to make him confront his insanity. Yet, what if his mind couldn't take that much stress? She wanted him back, but he would barely speak to her. He rode staring into the distance, his mind working on problems she could only guess at. They approached the border to Alethkar, their scouts warned to watch for organized resistance. They found none. The villages they soon located knew nothing other than that Lord Dalinar had ridden to battle some weeks before. Whatever was happening in the center of the kingdom, it hadn't reached such insignificant locations. So they turned their bulky trail along the northern Chamavan Ridge, a line of stormlands that pointed directly east. At their current marching speed, they would reach Kholinar in less than a week. There, Jasnah hoped to find answers. Chapter 73. Shinri, 14. The ocean air smelled odd to Shinri. There was a coolness to it, a purity. The gentle rocking of the waves was calming in its repetition. It was so peaceful at times that she was almost able to ignore the twisting frustration she felt within. The peace was a lie. Though the boats moved with a sluggish rocking, their ponderous motions hid a demonic inevitability. They were taking her back to Avan. All of her attempts to escape, all of her planning and her worrying had been useless. In fact, her efforts had been worse than useless. Before her escape, she had at least been separated from him. Fate was a gleeful satirist, taking her struggles and using them to bind her even more closely to the man she hated. Though she sat primly on the deckside bench, wearing a new thala and shaded by a parasol, she felt as if she were drowning, as if she were tied to a boulder and sinking beneath the waves, being pulled toward the black depths, despite her frantic struggles to swim back up. "You're being foolish," Shinri told herself firmly. "You're going north, true, but you aren't going to him. Merrin won't turn you over. In fact, he'll probably leave you somewhere secure when he takes his armies to aid Alethkar." But Merrin didn't understand King Avan. Avan was so powerful of both mind and will. Merrin had fought well on the Nana docks, but he was still just a boy. Avan was something else, something barely human, something more like Lady Jasnah, capable of manipulating the emotions and politics of entire nations with frightening consistency. Could Merrin protect her? Shinri doubted it. Only distance would keep her from Avan Vedanel. Several Lachenran handmaidens sat beside her, and they suddenly began whispering excitedly in their tongue. Shinri didn't need to look to know that Merrin had emerged from his cabin. He walked the foredeck often, obviously preferring the open sky to the confines of his quarters. Shinri eyed the handmaidens, noting with dissatisfaction their dreamy looks and giggling blushes. In a way, however, they had a right to their idolization. They didn't know Merrin. To them, he was simply the handsome young warrior who had so dramatically defeated 5 shard-bearers at once. He had single-handedly ended 30 years of oppression, freeing Lachenran and restoring its monarchy. Sensational retellings of that day had embellished the truth, making it seem like Merrin had flown with the winds themselves, making 100-foot leaps and striking down his foes with ease. How could the girls not fawn over such a seemingly legendary figure? Shinri forced herself to look at him, studying the man Merrin Kholin. He wore new clothing, though, like always, he had kept the deep blue Kholin cloak that didn't quite fit him. He stood straight-backed and confident as he looked northward, several aides speaking quietly at his side. He had a power, too, though not the same kind as Avan. Merrin didn't control events consciously, but he had a habit of putting himself in extreme situations and surviving. Such people as he created stories unintentionally, influencing the world by presence rather than design. Of course, there was more to him than that. The stories told of that day on the docks were exaggerated, but Shinri had been there to see the truth behind them. She had seen Merrin leap from the deck of a ship and land safely on the wooden docks some 20 or 30 feet below. She had seen him jump toward his enemies, covering an unnatural distance in the air, then swing his blade with inhuman power. He had sliced a man in shard plate completely in two, treating the awakened metal as if it were nothing more than common steel. Renarin had been right. Merrin Kholin was not a normal man. He was indeed both a fool and a hero. And he was also her enemy. There was no quibbling about this fact in her mind. Shinri's captivity was unspoken, but it was real. Merrin had refused her request to let her remain in Lochenrun, showing a hint of guilt in his eyes as he did so. He knew that she was no guest, nor just a lady beneath his protection. She was his prisoner, his tool. Yet he was not an undefeatable enemy. He was no Aven, capable of quelling her with a single glance. Beneath the hero, he was still a confused boy. Shinri could see the worries and uncertainties in his eyes. He was growing more self-confident, of course, as his authority increased. That, however, would only make him more vulnerable. Lady Yasna had often said that noblemen were far more easy to manipulate than peasants. Peasants would do what you said, true, but their simple honesty often made their hearts difficult to sway. A nobleman learned to be more compromising, and a man who compromised could be exploited. Citizens only had one imperative: follow commands. Noblemen had to follow multiple masters, and the reconciliation between their ethics, their beliefs, their commands, and their goals was another potential source of exploitation. Shinri was fairly certain she had determined Merrin's weakness, his honor. She watched him carefully, waiting for him to dismiss his aides. He usually did so eventually, for he liked to watch the waves alone. After a few moments, he waved the men away, then stepped forward to stand beside the gunwale in his customary position. Stilling her nerves, Shinri rose. Days spent in contemplation had determined that she had only one chip to play. Hopefully, it would be enough. Merrin glanced at her as she approached, then turned back toward his contemplation of the ocean. The blue sea was dotted with ships, the other 4 10-set vessels of the fleet floating around their flagship. Smaller vessels scuttled between the ships, delivering messages or shifting supplies. Now, standing closer, she could see that Merrin's face was even more troubled than usual. He stared toward the ships, not toward the goal ahead. "To keep looking toward me for instructions," he said. Shinri paused. Was he asking her advice? "Shouldn't they seek your leadership?" "I don't see why they should," he said. "Who am I to have anything important to say?" "You are their savior," Shinri said carefully. Merrin snorted. "I didn't bring them salvation, Shinri. I just killed some men. It's nothing special. That's what I've been trained to do. If they want a savior, they should look to the monk who trained me in dueling, or perhaps the sergeants who taught me the spear." "You did more than just kill people, Merrin," Shinri said. "You gave the Lochenruns courage. You gave them a will to fight, then convinced them to sail north, to face their enemy, and you could quite possibly save your own kingdom in the process." Merrin didn't appear persuaded by her logic. He leaned against the gunwale pensively, tapping his finger against the wood. He was wearing the jade bracelet again, she noticed. He'd gone without it for several days after the battle, but now it was back. "Tamar's king now," Merrin said. "He leads this people, not me. Yet he keeps sending messengers to ask my will for the fleet, as if I would know about water foraging or scouting processes. He wants my input on everything. It almost seems like he wants my approval. Do you think, perhaps, that he was beneath Vaden command so long that he feels inadequate leading on his own?" "Perhaps," Shinri said. "But not likely." "Why then?" Merrin asked. "Why keep looking to me?" "Well," Shinri said, "you did kind of appoint him as king." "No, I didn't," Merrin complained. "Sure you did," Shinri said. "What did you think you were doing when you walked up and bestowed that shard blade upon him? Everyone had just seen the way you fought. There are already whispers of your being an epic warrior, and I wouldn't be surprised to find Renarin behind them. Either way, you set yourself up as something greater than a monarch, something capable of offhandedly granting a king a shard blade, then commanding him to lead his people at your will. And you're surprised that now he thinks he has to seek your approval?" Merrin blushed at the comment, glancing down toward the passing waves below. He was so earnest. That didn't stop him from being her enemy, but it did make him somewhat more tolerable. A part of her, a very small part, true, but it was there nonetheless, was reticent to take advantage of his weaknesses. However, she felt far more terrified of returning to Avon than she felt guilty for using Merrin. "There is something I must speak to you about," she said carefully, trying to make her voice sound weak and feminine. Merrin looked up, sensing a change in the conversation. "This is about our returning to Alethkar, isn't it?" he guessed. Shinri nodded. "I have already promised you that you will be in no danger," he said. "I won't bring you into the war, Shinri, but I have to see that you are kept safe. I can only do that if you are here, with the fleet." "Where I can keep track of you," his voice implied. She trailed off, allowing a little bit of her fear to show in her eyes. It came out more forcefully than she had expected, her honest emotions boiling free. She was surprised to feel a tear run down her cheek. "What?" Merrin asked with alarm, perking up. "I can't go back to him, Merrin," Shinri whispered. "Who?" Merrin asked. "King Avon?" Shinri nodded. Merrin, that man took me as his wife. He claimed me, made me his own, and forced himself upon me." Merrin paled, his Aleth sensibilities wrung by her blunt words. She exaggerated, of course, but he needn't know that she had gone willingly that first time. "I can't go back," she said intensely. "I can't be near him. Even with your promises of safety, I spent nights awake, terrified. If he defeats you, if he destroys the Aleth armies, he will come for me. Whatever keep you sequester me in, it won't be strong enough to resist his rage. He was harsh to me before, when he thought me subservient. If he catches me now, after I defied him and tried to run—" She paused, looking up and meeting his eyes. "He hurt me before, Merrin," she whispered. "If he finds me again, it will be worse. Far worse. If you bring me to Alethkar with you, then what he does to me will be partially your fault." This was her chip. She could see the struggle of honor within him, the weight of her words pressing against his desire to help Alethkar. He was a good man, and good men, unfortunately, were often the easiest to manipulate. He opened his mouth to respond, but Shinri cut him off with a calculated plea. "Send me to Thalana," she asked, "on one of the smaller scout ships. I know King Amelin. He is a friend. You won't be losing me. you'll be putting me in a safe location. A fortified island, well patrolled and well defended. I can plead Alethkar's need before the king. He will listen to me and perhaps send support. Merrin considered her words. I don't know, he finally said. You don't know? She said. You would use me. Just like him. At least he only took my body. You want my powers, too. No, Merrin objected. Then let me go, she challenged. Prove your honor, Lord Cullen. Prove that you deserve the respect this fleet has seen fit to give you. And now, the most powerful words of all, at least where Merrin is concerned. Ask yourself, Merrin, what would Lord Dalinar tell you to do? Merrin closed his eyes. Finally, he took a deep breath and turned away from her. Very well, he agreed.
Chapter 74. Taln 12. When the army made camp for the evening, Taln went searching for height. High land wasn't hard to find in Roshar, this world of barren stone. Though the winds pushed the land toward uniformity, the rains formed gulches and crags. Stone crumbled to dust, which in turn blew off with the winds and mixed with the crumb minerals to harden into rock once again. The resulting land was broken, full of cliffs and hills. Taln found his way to a small plateau, one only a short distance from the army but hidden from its eyes. The overlook let him see into the distance, across farmlands and hills. The grim stone still seemed a harsh sight to Taln, even after all these years. Where the common people saw fertile hills, perfect for planting their grain polyps, Taln saw only the lifeless rock. To him, fertility would always imply greenness, trees and grasses, buds, fruits, and flowers, color. The memories seemed so real. Even after 3 millennia, he could recall stark images from Lar. Other events faded, but his home, a place of peaceful waves and temperate rains, remained. Perhaps the image was so strong because it was simply the delusion his mind was most fond of imagining. His doubt felt like a betrayal. Yet how could he not wonder? Perhaps there was a reason the sign didn't work. Perhaps there was a reason he couldn't find the power he kept reaching to touch. If he was no herald, then there was no power. No lost Na'el bond. No missing brethren. Just a confused man with some very vivid delusions. But could madness fabricate such realism? He remembered his mother's face. He remembered and knew the other heralds, not just by appearance, but by their habits, their interests, and their favorite phrases. He remembered standing on a hilltop watching the great city of Kanar fall to the powers of awakening. He saw Khothin, not as stories or songs, but as they were. He knew their spindly limbs and their eyeless heads, heads split by a bone ridge that made the creatures appear as if they wore a perpetually wide, malicious smile. Taln had fought and died. He could remember the pain of crushed limbs and ribs. Could madness imitate the memories of an entire lifetime? What of the things he knew? The passage beneath Rel Aram, the location of the 9 shard blades, his ability to fight. These were not the possessions of a random farmer from Rimac. But could they have come from somewhere else? Forgotten experience fighting as a mercenary? Lost maps or other texts, read during a time before the madness came? What did he really know that couldn't conceivably have come from either a book or a delusion? He could see the darkness lurking on the horizon, and he welcomed the coming high storm. He stood and walked to the edge of the plateau, standing on its very lip, waiting as the high storm approached. He raised his arms before it, Glifting held in a firm grip, and let the winds crash into him with sudden, icy force.
"Why?"
Taln demanded of the gale.
"Why must you make me question?"
Rain splashed his face, water quickly soaking clothing and skin.
"You said we took this task upon ourselves," he challenged. "You said you would grant our wish. You warned that we would bear our burdens alone, but you never said you would take away our self-confidence."
The storm, the voice of the Almighty, gave only more rain and winds as an answer.
"How can I be stalwart if I don't know who I am?" Taln screamed. "How can I be determined when I am uncertain of my own sanity? How can I save a people if I don't trust the truths I teach? We know the error of our decision. Must you prove it further? Is not the time between returns enough? Must you steal from us our short time of life as well?"
The rain fell, snapping against his face and proffered chest.
"They're your people too," Taln yelled. "Would you abandon me now? Would you abandon them?"
Wind tore at his cloak. No answer came. Eventually Taln raised his arms, gripping Glifting in wet palms. His dueling form was as old as man's time on Roshar. It represented 3,000 years of perfecting and practice. Men did not live who could face it in battle. He fell into it now, swinging his blade through sheets of rain, sparring as if with the winds themselves. He practiced for some time, seeking solace in the forms he had used so long. But even this familiar activity brought no peace. Were his forms the tool of an ancient herald, or just the fabrications of a crazed mind? He swung Glifting vengefully, spraying drops of water into the wind only to have them blown back upon him again. Eventually he lowered Glifting, his breath coming in gasps from the wild swinging. He sighed, turning to seek shelter, and discovered that he was not alone on the lonely plateau. He looked upon her, standing by herself, and knew the source of much of his frustration. His questions wouldn't have held as much weight if he hadn't known of the reward a right answer could bring. She stood in the rain, dark hair pulled from braids to streak across her face. Somehow she had escaped her watchful guards, a fact not half as disconcerting as her ability to approach him unheard. Even in the midst of a storm, he should have noticed her arrival. He had been far too absorbed in his sparring. She stepped forward, her wet brown sencoat tied at the front, sleeves dripping streams of water. Her face, stripped of face paint by the rains, was pale and concerned. Taln let Glifting's tip tap against the stone below. The winds blew over the cliffside behind him, buffeting Taln with one vengeful burst before tapering slightly as the storm lulled.
"Taln," Jasnah said, "you should come back to the camp. Lord Eliezer brought tents. You could escape the rains."
Her voice was weak above the sound of the falling rain. Taln shook his head, turning back over the cliffside toward the now darkened farmlands below.
"No," he said. "I have to think. I have to know why I live when my brethren are dead. There don't seem to be any answers."
Jasnah paused.
"Perhaps there are answers," she said, "just not the ones you want to find."
Taln looked back at her. She looked apprehensive, as if her words might have set off something within him. She still thought him mad.
"Of course she does. You've given her no reason to think otherwise. In fact, you've begun to question it yourself."
Still, her uncertainty hurt him. It was painful to see the doubt in her eyes, to sense that she didn't trust him and never could, not as long as she thought him insane.
"Taln," she said, "what if there is another answer? What if that answer lies with a warrior from Rimac? A mercenary or wandering spearman like those we've gathered as we've traveled. A good man, a knowledgeable man, one who taught himself to read somehow. Perhaps a general or a leader of some sort.
A man to whom something very terrible happened. Something he doesn't want to remember. What if, instead of remembering his own life, this man remembered stories he had heard from his childhood? Stories of heroes and gods. Stories of heralds who seemed beyond the pains of normal men. He knew of the holy city and its statues. He went there, and within the cracks of the floor discovered a shard blade. This became his proof, the sign that he was indeed a herald. And so he left his old life striving to warn of the return, to try and stop others from hurting, so that maybe he could stop the hurt within himself. She looked up at him guiltily, her lashes and brows dripping rainwater as if she had exposed his secrets for the world to see. If there was any truth to her postulations, however, Taln could not sense it.
"I don't know, Jasna," he said.
"You can't remember anything," she pressed. "Brother Lon says that often when a man loses his memories, it's because of something terrible he experienced." Taln turned from her.
"You once asked me what happens to me when I lose control during those times when I feel close to despair. I see fires around me. Everything burns, and I feel as if something dark is approaching, something I must never let touch me. A terrible, monstrous, dark creature. And I hear screaming. I hear mad, terrible howls, the screams of some wretch being put through inhuman agony."
He looked back, meeting her eyes.
"I recognize the voice which screams, Jasna. It is my own."
She raised her arms slightly toward her chest, her slight gasp lost in the waning high-storm sounds. Her face was disturbed, concerned, some of both. Taln turned away, and then she was there, crossing the distance between them in a couple of steps and grabbing a hold of him with wet arms. The warmth of her body was an alien feeling against his cold skin. He let Glifting slide from his fingers, the blade clanging softly to the stone, and wrapped his arms around her. "Come to Aliskar," she pled, her cheek pressed against the wet cloth of his chest. "Come and help me drive away the invaders. I will see you rewarded with a city befitting your honor and a title to match your nobility. Forget about the things you have dreamed, Taln. Don't let them hurt you any longer. Come back. Come back with me."
"And Meridas?"
"Meridas can rot," Jasna spat. Taln closed his eyes, breathing deeply the wet air. Most men could ask nothing more than this. A kingdom to honor and a woman to hold. But could he? "Forget the things you have dreamed."
"Could it all really be a dream?"
he asked quietly.
"And you, my awakener?"
She stiffened slightly at the word. Yes, she knew what it was to hide from oneself. If his memories made him who he was, if his memories gave him purpose, what would he be without them?
"You would have her."
He had forgotten, perhaps intentionally, how much he missed that. Upon Jezrien's request, the heralds had forsaken themselves of intimate relationships. They needed to remain clear-minded, able to give their lives in a moment. They could have no bonds to this world, lest it pull them back and threaten the stability of their purpose. Yet, if he were no herald, her warmth was so comforting at his side. But what then? He would still remember. If the anxiety of wondering at his sanity were so great, how much more potent would his insecurity be if he thought he'd abandoned the world to destruction? How could he live? Even considering such things made his uncertainty rise, and the fires began to smolder. He contained them by looking at her. He looked into hopeful eyes.
"I will have to think about this, Jasna,"
he said. Think about what? admitting that he was insane, that everything he knew and remembered was nothing more than a delusional lie?
Yes, he told himself, that is exactly what I will consider. I must confront this. I will think, he repeated.
And we'll have to move in through the north, through the valleys to mask our approach. Even still, they're bound to have... Meridas trailed off, looking up from his map as he noticed Taln standing in the tent doorway. Eliezer frowned openly at the intrusion, but Meridas was far better at hiding his displeasure.
"What is this?" Taln asked. "The scouts have returned with news of Kholinar? Why was I not informed?"
"We thought this beneath your notice, Holy One," Meridas said with a smooth voice. "It is only a preliminary report, and your divine presence hardly needs—"
"I may or may not be insane, Meridas," Taln interrupted. "But I am definitely not an idiot. Do not patronize me."
Meridas simply smiled.
"What did the scouts find?"
Taln asked, striding forward and regarding the tabletop map. Eliezer had brought more than men to their expedition. His supply carts carried tents, furniture, and some surprisingly detailed landscape maps. His knowledge of eastern Alethkar was so remarkable, in fact, that it was suspicious. One had to wonder what his plans might have included should Alethkar have fared worse in the Pralir Wars.
"Kholinar is besieged," Eliezer said, "held by a force of several thousand." "How many is several, Eliezer?"
Taln said, scanning the map. A smaller section had been arranged with a crudely sketched layout of Kholinar and the surrounding territory, and this was marked with several troop groupings. The larger map, which showed the surrounding geography, told him something that the other two had already noticed, that their own army would have to change its route slightly. With care, they might be able to get within a few hours' march of the city without being discovered.
3,000 foot, 600 heavy infantry, and perhaps 500 archers, with towers,"
Taln grunted. "Smaller than our force in numbers," Meridas pointed out.
"But with the advantage of location, not to mention the archers," Taln said. "I am new to this epic's methods of war, but I suspect that those towers will be problematic."
Eliezer nodded. They had been forced to leave the man's own towers behind in the name of speed, and their force had barely 200 archers.
"We do have the advantage of shard-bearers, I would assume," he said.
"Yes," Meridas said. "Most armies carry barely one blade per 10 squad. Assuming averages hold true, this force will be lucky to be armed by 3 or 4 shard-bearers. Fewer, probably, since they haven't attacked the city itself yet. It might be best for us to skirt this army entirely. We need to join with the bulk of Alethkar's forces." There was a sudden commotion outside the tent, marked by the presence of an angry feminine voice. Beside the table, Meridas rolled his eyes, and Eliezer smiled in amusement. "We should probably suffer her," Meridas said with a sigh. "She won't leave us alone until she's been placated. Her brother indulged her by allowing her to play general with his armies."
"Surely you don't,"
Eliezer said. Meridas laughed.
"By the winds, no. Elhokar is a soft-hearted brother, and he indulged her far too much. You can see the result. The woman will learn her place once our wedding is official." If he caught Taln's dark look at that last comment, he gave no obvious indication. "Anyway, for now, there is little to do besides let her in and humor her momentarily so that we may be rid of her quickly." "As you say, Lord Meridas,"
Eliezer said, waving for an attendant to relay the message. Taln himself hadn't had any trouble gaining entrance. The army was still ostensibly his, and they couldn't very well bar him from the command tent. Yasna, obviously, was not afforded the same consideration. She stalked into the tent chamber a few moments later. Another woman might have thrown a tirade, but she simply shot Meridas a thin-eyed glance, then strode over to regard the various maps. "We are too late to bring my brother warning, then," she said. Meridas raised an eyebrow. "After taking Rel Aram from the inside, the invaders could hope to keep the city's fall a secret," Yasna replied, "but they could never lay a siege like this without word eventually reaching my brother. At least we know that Alethkar hasn't been conquered yet."
"We don't know that," Meridas said. "The invaders could have already destroyed King Elhokar's army, then sent separate divisions to capture the larger cities and quell rebellion."
Yasna shook her head. "This is too small a force," she said, "and it's arranged for an extended siege, not an offensive. It is meant to cut off Dalinar's retreat and to disrupt his supplies. If the invaders had won, they would not have wasted any time before taking Kholinar. It holds an oath gate and, other than Rel Aram, is the most important city in the kingdom. The invaders wouldn't waste time with a siege, they would attack quickly and decisively. Trying to starve the city would be an act of foolishness. Consider the number of awakeners it holds."
"She's probably right,"
Taln agreed. He didn't look toward Yasna. Every time he met her eyes, he saw the appeal therein. "We need to attack," Yasna decided. "We can't leave this enemy at our backs, and freeing Kholinar would be a powerful aid to our allies."
"Yes, well," Meridas said, "we will consider it."
Yasna ignored him, leaning down closely, running her finger along the map as if tracing a path. "We can do it easily," she said. "They won't be expecting a force to come upon them from the west. We should send a smaller contingent to strike toward the gates quickly from the east, and they will assume it's a breaking force, meant to try and bring a message from Elhokar's army into the city. They'll react quickly, pulling their forces forward to defend the city gates, exposing them to fire from Kholinar itself, and leaving their towers relatively unguarded at the back of the main body. We can send mounted shard-bearers to cut down the towers, then attack from the east, and retain the height advantage as we come down the lip of the Late."
"As I said, Yasna," Meridas said with obvious annoyance, "we are quite capable of—" "No, wait, Meridas," Anniezer said, pulling at his frazzled gray beard, studying the map with consternation. "The woman's words have merit."
"Kholinar undoubtedly still has troops guarding its walls," Yasna continued. "When they see our attack, they'll raise the gates and sally, trapping the Vaden army between two hostile foes. They'll be boxed, armies to the north and south, arrows falling from the west, and a late cliffside to their west. Their towers will have fallen, and I doubt the force has even a single shard-bearer. It would be foolish to waste shard blades on what is intended to be little more than a blockade."
Meridas frowned. "It is too early to make definite plans," he finally said. "Let us get closer to Kholinar, where we can perform better reconnaissance. Then we will develop a firm strategy."
Anniezer nodded in agreement, and after a brief pause, Yasna nodded as well, admitting the truth to Meridas's words. The two noblemen left together, Meridas postulating whether or not the Awakener knew how to create Shinovar Dalaltatan, and suggesting that the two try the vegetable for their evening repast. Taln stood, feeling a sudden tension as Yasna's eyes fell on him, then hurried out of the tent without looking at her. She remained behind, beside the battle map, watching him go. He stepped out into the late afternoon light, taking a deep breath to still his tension. He knew it was foolish to avoid her, as if he were a child fleeing before the censure of a displeased parent, and yet those eyes of hers only lent fuel to his own questionings and uncertainties. He had to decide, but he couldn't do so with her looking at him like that. The aggregate Herald's army was arrayed before him. Aniezer's troops were well disciplined, their dark brown tents arranged in careful squadrons of 100 men, each one emblazoned with the Tsar glyph. Tsar. Preparation. Indeed, this was no despot's ragged, bullying collection of thugs. This was a true army. Its presence helped discipline within Taln's own troops. The men became stronger and more unified simply by being forced to march alongside Aniezer's superior warriors. The two groups of men retained a division, true, but the whole was a far more effective group than Taln's men had been on their own. Yes, this was an army now. The men were beginning to feel like soldiers, and their training reflected that. Taln had once told Jasna that he would not lead these men under false pretenses. He had persuaded himself to continue even after he had discovered her manipulations, for he felt that training the men would help them against the Hosen. But if he was no herald, then he had perpetuated lies of the most blasphemous degree. His self-righteous proclamation that intention mattered now seemed laughable. What of the intentions of a madman? What good did it matter to the soldiers whether they had been gathered by a man who sincerely thought himself a herald or not? The result was the same. They had been lied to. Taln sighed, walking away from the command tent. Years of conditioning kept his head high, his step firm, despite his inner turmoil. That, too, was a lie. The men saw him and gathered strength from his supposed confidence. But that was the way it had always been, hadn't it? His questioning was like a rodent, digging and gnawing at a wall that had been poorly patched. Jasna's questions unearthed shames and uncertainties Taln had thought long buried. Even during his moments of greatest confidence, they had been there, a tiny but unnoticed leak in the presumably indestructible wall of his own morality. He knew, even when he tried to forget, that the heralds were not what mankind presumed them to be. He knew secrets, things that his brethren hid from their own people. Burdens taken in the name of the greater good. But what were these things? Ravings? Reflections of his own paranoia? As he walked, he saw the horse pens. Aniezer kept 2 10-sets of the animals. Taln had known kings with less fine stock. He remembered the difficulty in bringing the beasts to Roshar, and, upon visiting again 800 years later for the second return, he remembered his relief upon discovering that mankind had found a way to breed and keep horses despite Roshar's harshness. Almost every other sign of Lar had died out, but horses remained. What of these memories? These things seemed so logical to him. Was his mind so wounded that it could fill in holes in its own reasonings, accepting for fact things that others would have found laughable? This army would go to war in just a few days. He had little time to decide. If he determined that he was not a herald, then he could no longer ride at their head. This much he promised. He would not lie to others as he had lied to himself. Yet if he was a herald, he had no business going to war on Alethkar's behalf. After the destruction of Kanar, Jezrien and Nael had decided that heralds could not engage in the politics of men. The Ilin were to leave the wars of mankind alone unless absolutely necessary for the protection of the greater good. As a herald, it was Taln's duty to move on, probably to Thalena, which he had heard retained a very stable monarchy.
And if you are a herald, where are the others?
The swords had been buried for hundreds of years. If he was a herald, then he was alone. That in itself was almost a powerful enough worry to make him wish to be mad, rather than face the prospect of protecting Roshar on his own. And behind all of his fears and deliberations sat those beautiful, concerned eyes. Even more powerful than uncertainty was another emotion he had never thought to feel again. There had never been time or opportunity for it before, and now that it came upon him, he was completely surprised by its appearance, and equally uncertain how to deal with it. Taln sighed, looking east toward Kholinar and the concerns of men. He would soon be forced to make a decision, one way or another. Chapter 75 Dalinar 7. Dalinar pulled off his helm, wiping the blood from his brow as he led his horse back toward his army's main body. Beside him, Echothan's voice rang with the mutterings of a 10-set curses. Light infantry marched around them. What had begun as a 10 squad had taken serious casualties, leaving barely 500 men alive. The ambush should have gone far better. It wasn't that Dalinar had expected to do serious damage to the Vaden army. This ambush, like others, had simply been another delaying tactic. As long as the Vadens feared ambush, they would move more carefully, and Dalinar's struggling force could stay ahead. No, this day's skirmish had not been intended to deal any serious damage. Elokar Kholin had obviously thought different.
Kanalhin, Kaprolin, and Kachayan,
Echothan swore, using the first 3 names of the Almighty. One of Echothan's tributing lords, Lord Tenmach, had been among those killed this day. Tenmach's squad had been cut off from the main troop, flanked by enemy forces who should have been detained by Elokar's 10 squad. Elokar, however, hadn't stayed back as the plan dictated. Instead, he had pushed his troops forward, trying to cut through to the Vaden commanders. By the time Elokar had realized the futility of the action, Dalinar's force had already suffered massive casualties. Dalinar glanced behind. The Vaden force was there, of course, ever behind them like a dark mold on the horizon. They weren't giving specific chase to Dalinar's group. Their leader, whoever it may be, was too clever for that. For all he knew, Dalinar's hasty retreat was leading into a second, more devastating ambush. The invaders had a 2-to-1 advantage in troops. They were big enough to be confident, but still too small to take hasty risks. That was perhaps the only reason why the Aleth forces were still alive. The men marching with Dalinar were a morose, solemn lot. Morale was terrible, as could be expected. No army liked to be on the perpetual retreat. However, the Aleth forces suffered from an even greater problem, and the men could sense it. Though Dalinar and Elokar's armies remained separated out of principle, they were required to rely on one another to work against the invaders. They camped beside one another and coordinated delaying tactics. However, neither group held the obvious command. The army was like 2 pigs tied to one rope. Each move was a struggle, each plan a potential disaster. Elokar refused to meet with Dalinar face-to-face, instead insisting that they communicate via messengers. The sense of disorder mixed with the foe behind left the men with very little to rely upon. The main troop had already set camp in the evening light, or, more appropriately, it had set up 2 separate camps that happened to sit next to one another. Dalinar made for the western camp, which was slightly larger. To the right, he could see Elokar's own ambush force marching into camp. Dalinar reined in his horse as the men lethargically made their way toward the mess tent. He looked over at Echothan. The Carden man had always been a soldier of great energy, but even he was beginning to show signs of fatigue. His plate was a mismatch of pieces, half his regular light blue, half scavenged from the suits of the fallen. It would take several weeks for his own twisted and scarred pieces to reform themselves. Dalinar's own plate looked little better. He kept more of his original pieces, but they were covered with dents, gashes, and nicks. "Come, my friend," Dalinar said. "We have planning to do." Echothan nodded.
"For all the good it will do us," he muttered.
Impressively, the initial retreat had been performed with relatively little loss. Some of the bulkier items, such as tents and furniture, had been left behind out of necessity. However, their stores of emeralds, sapphires, and basic food preparation items had mostly survived the chaotic withdrawal. Dalinar could only ascribe the miracle to the effectiveness of his stewards. If the army somehow survived the next few weeks, he vowed to raise the men all a rank or 2. Dalinar's pavilion had been far too bulky to bring. However, his stewards had located a smaller tent, brought by a lesser nobleman, and appropriated it in Dalinar's name. The tent was smaller than he was accustomed to, but at least it was shelter. Many of his men didn't even have that much. There were no chairs inside. Dalinar had ordered all lords to abandon any furniture that had survived the original withdrawal. It was too heavy to carry. Dalinar wouldn't have servants collapsing from the rushed march simply because their lord wanted a comfortable place to sit his posterior. Echothan, his shard plate removed, settled himself on a cushion as the scouts entered the tent to give their report. Dalinar remained standing. Pollen, the head of Dalinar's scouts, was a thick-necked man with a warrior's build and a bristly mustache. He was a lord, but as the mustache indicated, he had little care for courtly ways. Solitary and curt, but observant, he served well in his place. "Well?" Dalinar asked. Pollen didn't care much for formality.
"They're definitely Vaden, my lord,"
the man said in his grunting voice.
"I got close enough to the main body to see glyph seals from all 3 of the Vaden houses. I recognized a couple of the faces, too."
Dalinar nodded. He had concluded the same during this last battle. For a time he had maintained his belief that the invaders were the mysterious army from Pralir, but that had apparently been a hasty conclusion.
"Filthy hogs," Echothan said. "It's little wonder they wouldn't give much aid to the Pralir campaign. They were planning to betray Alethkar as soon as it got back."
"You didn't send help to the Pralir war either, my friend," Dalinar pointed out.
"Yes, but I always gave my reasons," Echothan said. "The Vadens, they hedged and promised. It's a wonder that Nolanar never signed that treaty. Everyone knows Vadens are about as trustworthy as smoke."
"Were you able to determine who leads the Vaden army?" Dalinar asked.
Pollen shook his head. "Their scouts are storm-cursed good, my lord. I lost 3 men on this mission as it is. We couldn't get close enough to read the glyph on the central tent."
Dalinar nodded with a sigh. The army was probably led by Talshech Devar. Before the nonsense with Crossguard began, the man had been arranging a coup of the 3 houses. Apparently, he had decided not to stop with his own throne. Dalinar wished he knew how the man had managed to get past the southern Aleth fortifications so quickly and quietly.
"My lord," Pollen continued, "I passed by the scene of your skirmish on my way back. They were killing the wounded again."
Dalinar closed his eyes, exhaling softly, while Echothan muttered a few more curses. Dalinar had sent scouts back to Crossguard, hoping that they would discover that a Vaden holding force had been arranged to hold the abandoned men. Instead, they had found only corpses. Anyone Dalinar abandoned was slaughtered.
"Thank you, Pollen,"
Dalinar said, dismissing the scout.
Pollen nodded. "A messenger from Kholinar arrived while you were gone, my lord," he said as he withdrew. "Shall I send a scribe to read the letter?"
"Yes, thank you." The tent flap rustled as the beefy scout left, and Dalinar shared a look with Echothan.
"This isn't good,"
the Carden man noted. Dalinar nodded. He walked over and unrolled his map of Alethkar, then weighed it down on the stone floor with rocks at the corners. His female calligraphers had marked the army's current location as requested, as well as that of the trailing army. They were near the middle of the kingdom, a little to the north and east. At first, Dalinar had hoped to make for Kholinar, where he could have, perhaps, rallied some more forces. Their pursuer, however, had anticipated this intention. The Vaden king kept his forces eastward, herding the refugee group to the west, away from Dalinar's center of power. "So what are our choices?" Dalinar asked. "We can't continue to wander as we have." Echothan cocked his head slightly, as if not in complete agreement.
"We need to take the path with the most valleys, Dalinar. Every potential ambush will slow them down."
Dalinar shook his head.
"Slowing them won't save us in the end, my friend. They'll catch us eventually, no matter how clever our pathfinding. We need to make a stand somewhere."
"Cardenar?" Echothan offered.
"I brought most of my forces with me, but there are some remaining. Our passing would gather several thousand more troops.
And bring an inevitable war to your people, Dalinar said. No, I won't do that to the restful city. Besides, it's too far. We'd be dead before we got there. Echothan grunted, leaning over, his shadow falling across the map as he studied their options.
Teth Canar,
he finally said. Dalinar nodded. The port city was their only option. It was a third city of goodly size and fortification.
Our only problem will be Lord Intara, Echothan said.
Intara's not a problem, Dalinar said. He's an advantage. He was the only major Aleth Lord who didn't send troops to either myself or Elhokar. He'll have men to add to the army.
If he even lets us in the city, Echothan said with a snort.
He won't have much choice if we plant 3 armies on his doorstep, Dalinar said, smiling slightly. The image was increasingly appealing. Teth Canar was one of the more defensible cities in the kingdom, despite its unpleasant heritage. The real trick would be persuading Elhokar that it was the best place to go. A knock came at the tent post, and Dalinar stood, calling for the visitor to come in. A white-robed woman in her 40s entered. He thought he recognized her, but the face was difficult to place. Standard dark Aleth hair, cut short and without braids. The wife of a lesser officer, probably, who had become a scribe so that she could remain with her husband during extended campaigns. The woman bowed. "Which message would you like me to read first, my lord?" she asked, holding up 2 sheets of paper. Dalinar paused.
"There are 2?" he asked. "Who from?"
"The first is from your wife, my lord," the woman said. "The second is from Her Majesty, Queen Nanava. It came just a few minutes ago."
Nanava,
Dalinar thought, shooting a glance at Echothan. The bald-headed warrior shrugged, leaning back on his cushion in a relaxed position.
"Read the one from Kane first," Dalinar ordered. "It is very short, my lord," the scribe said. "It reads, 'My dearest betrothed, I don't know if you got my other messages or not. I did receive your man. He was very brave in escaping the forces that chased him. Kholinar is still under siege, though the army hasn't attacked us yet. I put 2 10-set men in painted armor and have them walking the ramparts. Perhaps the invading force will think that we have more shard-bearers than we do. The citizens are training at Shieldhome with all diligence, but I don't think we have the forces to resist an attack. I don't know what happened at Crossguard, but I trust you have defeated the king. Please return to Kholinar with all haste.'"
The scribe looked up.
"And it is signed, 'With love, Kane Cardinar.'"
Echothan smiled with pride at the letter's content, and Dalinar didn't blame him. Kane was an impressive young woman, resourceful, clever, and determined. Despite her youth, she would preside over Kholinar in its time of need, giving the people the firm leadership it needed. However, her words worried Dalinar. Cutting off Kholinar so decisively was a very clever move. When Tal Shech had begun his campaign in Yaqaved, Dalinar had commissioned his spies to prepare a report on the Devar House leader. Nothing in that report had led Dalinar to expect such a competent enemy. Tal Shech was supposed to be a fine warrior, but only a passable tactician. Yet the moves he had made so far showed amazing subtlety and preparation. He did attack Crossguard too early, Dalinar reminded himself. That was one error. Whoever it is that leads this invading army, he can make mistakes. The trap isn't inescapable yet.
"And if Teth Canar is besieged too?"
Echothan said. "Then we will die," Dalinar said. "We can only hope that the Vaedens weren't able to infiltrate that far. They would have had to risk sending a force dangerously close to Crossguard to get to Teth Canar. We will also have to hope that Kholinar can hold out long enough for us to defeat the main Vaeden force." He didn't add the obvious, that if they didn't defeat the main Vaeden force, Kane and the rest of the upper Aleth nobility would be executed. "The second letter, please," Dalinar said to the scribe.
"It reads, 'My dear Lord Dalinar, I write this in the hopes that you might retain some measure of influence over my husband.
Though you two have come to arms recently, you must know the level of respect with which he regards you. My lord, I am deeply afraid. I feel weak admitting this, but I don't know to whom else I can turn. The force chasing us must belong to Tal Shech Davar, and its cohesion means that he has undoubtedly slain my brother, Avin Vedenel. My son's life is in great danger. Not only is Arden the heir to the Aleth throne, but he is also now the rightful ruler of the three houses. Tal Shech will have to make certain that the boy is— The scribe trailed off.
What?
Dalinar asked. I apologize, my lord, she said. The writing is smudged. It must have gotten wet. I think it says we'll have to make certain that the boy is killed, for Arden is a threat to his stability. It continues, I have asked, even pled with my lord Elhokar to let me take Arden and flee. There are those who would hide us. We needn't stay with the main bulk of the army, but could ride ahead and seek refuge in Cardanar, or perhaps find passage to Thalanah. Elhokar, however, insists on keeping his son with him during these dangerous times. Please, my lord, send a request to Elhokar. Persuade him that he must not let the Kholin line die here. He must let me flee. The scribe looked up. It is signed, Your Queen, Lady Nanava Vedenel. The words are written in a very hasty hand, my lord. I do not think she was in a completely solid state of mind when she penned them. Dalinar nodded thoughtfully. He could see the woman behind the words, a terrified, uncertain girl. Nanava had come far during the last year, but before that she had displayed a spoiled immaturity and unwillingness to perform her duties as queen. She wasn't ready to face the possibility that being Elhokar's wife might very well mean her death. Do you have your writing tools with you? He asked the scribe. The scribe nodded. They're outside, my lord, she said. Fetch them, Dalinar requested.
You intend to do as she asks? Echothan asked curiously as the scribe left.
Dalinar nodded.
I need to send Elhokar a message anyway and complain of his actions today. Not that it will stop him from doing whatever the winds tell him, of course. Still, perhaps I can compose a letter that will make him agree that Teth Canar is the place to make our stand. Don't tell him you plan to fight there, Echothan said, reclining. Tell him you plan to get a ship at the port, then flee to Pralir. He'll want to go there for certain.
Dalinar frowned.
He's not that selfish. He wouldn't leave his men behind to die.
Echothan shrugged.
I think you'd be surprised.
Dalinar frowned. However, when he composed the letter, he did as Echothan had suggested.
Chapter 76. Yasna, 17. The men found out about the impending battle at Kholinar, of course, and it gave them the apprehensive excitement of an untested force. They understood that by the next evening they would be lamenting injuries and deaths, yet for the moment such things were only possibilities, odds of thrown chips, the turn of a numerologist's soothsaying glyph ward. Until the battle began, the men could imagine honor and excitement, victories won and bravery proven. Yasna was more pragmatic. Not only was she naturally that way, but she had much experience, thanks to her brother and father, with warfare. She knew both losses and victories, and understood that the two often felt hauntingly similar. Men would die at her command. True, many of them knew exactly what they were doing. Eniazer's force, while untested in large-scale battle, had the mindset of a mercenary force. Many of the other men, however, were more idealistic. They had come not truly at her beck, but at the call of the man they thought a herald, a man Yasna feared would fail them. Yasna watched Taln as the army went about its morning preparations, getting ready to march the short distance to Kholinar and spring her trap upon the Vaidens camped there. Taln had barely spoken to her over the last 3 days, and when he met her eyes, she saw the confused pain therein. He confronted his own insanity, and he did it for her. She wasn't certain what brought her more shame, the knowledge that he suffered so for her sake, or the worry that asking him to question himself would destroy her army. She still needed him at its head. While traveling from Rimac, they had gathered even more followers. News of Lord Anieser's acceptance of the Herald Talonel had provided vast credibility to her claims, for he had been the man to squash the last 3 false herald uprisings. The Herald section was now just as large as Anieser's section of the force. It had nearly 3,500 people, many gathered from Anieser's own villages, and by his suggestion. These men followed Taln, not her or Meridas. Without the banner of heraldship, there was a good chance they would not fight. She knew she shouldn't consider such things. She had confronted Taln for his own good, yet she worried. What if he did overcome his hallucinations? He would probably denounce himself before the army, and in doing so, destroy it as surely as an enemy ambush. She would never be able to take Kholinar with just Anieser's forces. A part of her didn't care. That part, indignant that she would put her own lies before Taln's well-being, wished desperately for him to admit he was no herald, for it would remove the great barrier of delusion that kept them apart. Yet the voice that whispered such things was the same underdeveloped piece of her that had always warned her not to manipulate others. She had always quieted it in the name of a better, more dominant good. What was the betrayal of a minor court ally if it gained her the knowledge she needed to protect the crown? What was the death of one squad of soldiers on a battlefield when their unwitting sacrifice protected a 10-squad others? What was the mind of one man when compared to the cohesion of a vital fighting force? That was the guilt she bore. It was not helped by seeing what she had done to him already. Where he had once stared forward with firm confidence, he now looked down in uncertainty. Where he had once declared, he now remained quiet. With misery, she realized that his stubborn self-confidence, the thing that had frustrated her so often, was also the very thing that had made Taln so compelling to her. Seeing him lost and indecisive was painful enough to make her wince whenever he looked her direction. What right did she have to ask him to change? Who was she to make such a demand, especially when she followed it with only the hint of a promise? He saw himself as the holy protector of an entire world, and she had asked him to give that up for her. She sighed, stretching and standing to the side as a group of soldiers dismantled her tent. Though Anieser had purchased her a relatively nice tala in one of the towns they had passed, for now she wore trousers and one of her tough sea-silk sencoats. It was odd how quickly she had grown to prefer the loose, comfortable clothing. When she had tried on the tala, she had found herself trying to walk with a full stride and had nearly tripped in surprise. The constrictive dress had made her feel short of breath and trapped, as if she were bound in tight ropes. She would have to grow accustomed to talas again, eventually, but for now she could maintain that wearing her sensible clothing was necessary, lest she ruin her only luxurious outfit. As she waited, she saw Meridas and Anieser leave the command tent and allowed herself a moment of seething frustration. Meridas was still firm in his declarations that a woman did not belong in the command tent, though they had adopted her plan for attacking the Vaden force, and even came to her for suggestions on strategy. They forbade her entrance into the daily planning meetings. While most of the things they discussed were minor issues, it was annoying to be left out. Besides, she knew more than they did. While the men had heard recitations from the great and historic strategic works, she had actually read the books And there was a difference, especially since she had read not only the dictations by the generals, but the often more enlightening comments added by their wives and daughters in the justification. Meridas bid Aniezer farewell, saying something in a low, almost suspicious voice before parting. Jasna thinned her eyes, watching the two go about their morning duties. Their allegiance was another item of great concern. She trusted Meridas about as much as she trusted the winds not to blow, and Aniezer's reputation was proof enough of his nature. Both men would do what best gained them power, and there was little she could do to check them. She had worked to build Taln's reputation and therefore power among Aniezer's troops, and she had encouraged her guards to make friends with those in Aniezer's personal bodyguard. Her resources were unfortunately very limited. Meridas noticed her watching, and unfortunately decided to stroll her direction. He barked a few orders at attendants, sending the men to do his will, and approached her alone. "Lady Jasna," he said with a panderer's smile, "I had hoped you would wear Lord Aniezer's gift this day, since we might enter Kholinar by nightfall. It wouldn't do for the court to see you dressed so, lest they mistake you for a stable boy." "I shall change once we obtain victory, Lord Meridas," Jasna replied flatly. "Of course," he said, glancing around. "I don't see our resident deity nearby. What shall you do without him to amuse you?" Jasna didn't reply, instead folding her arms and adopting an icy glare. "Of course," Meridas noted, looking back at her with eyes hiding a violent jealousy. "There will be another high storm tomorrow morning. The two of you can just run off then and amuse yourselves." Jasna started. "That night, on the highlands, you were seen asking after him, then left your guards and went to find him alone. There would have been talk. Of course Meridas knows about it." "I thought I told you to be discreet," Meridas said in a low voice. "I was worried, so I went to see where he was," Jasna said. "Nothing more." "Of course," Meridas said. She gritted her teeth, hissing slightly. "Go," she snapped, pointing. "Leave me." His eyes flashed with anger, and he looked at her with satisfaction. Jasna paused, pushing aside her feelings of revulsion. There was something in his eyes, something he probably didn't mean to reveal. "No matter," Meridas said. "This will be over soon, anyway." He stalked away, leaving her feeling somehow soiled by the entire conversation. Jasna stood for a moment, forcing herself to focus on the oddity she had sensed in his words. "Kemnar?" she requested. "I am here," he said, stepping forward from his almost unnoticed position beside the working tent soldiers. Having him back was such a wind-blessed relief that she had stopped worrying about releasing him from service. She needed him too much, for the moment at least. "Meridas is planning something," Jasna said. "Of course he is," Kemnar said. "Something specific," she said. "I need to know what it is. I need a list of any commands he and Aniezer have contrived in their planning councils over the last 3 days. Take Lon to scribe for you, and ask around. I need to know any changes they've made to the army's structure or orders, no matter how insignificant. And I need to know them before we attack this afternoon." "Yes, my lady," Kemnar said, already moving to do as she bid. This time, it felt different. She would have thought that war would be familiar to her by now. Her first tastes of battle had come during her childhood, when her father and his brothers had fought against Jarna the tyrant. By then, Jarna had already conquered most of Roshar. His mysterious allegiance with the Shin clans had allowed him to roll across the Second Peninsula like a raging high storm. Once Davar, Vadenal, and Prala had fallen, Alethkar had found itself threatened from both the south and the east. This she knew from the histories. Her memories of those days were different. Memories highlighted by the emotions she had seen on her father's stout face. Fear, confusion, and worry. Every nation on Roshar, even the island kingdom of Thelana, had fallen to Jarna's conquering. What hope did Alethkar have? But then Dalinar had slain the tyrant himself in single combat. Jarna's empire had fallen upon itself. Several of his generals had tried to lead the armies, but fracturing and rebellion had turned them against one another. Yasna's first true experiences with war hadn't come for another several years. Those days, once Jarna's armies had been defeated, her father had sought to re-establish Alethkar's historic boundaries. She had been young during the first Prala Wars, not even 18, but her father had quickly realized his daughter's tactical ability. Never a man who had cared much for propriety, Nolonarin had used her from that day onward. It had been a simple matter for her to transfer that service to Elhokar when he took his war of justice to the Prelir Highlands. Why should this battle feel so different from the others? She sat nervously in her saddle, waiting as the runners did one final scout of the enemy camp. The unfamiliar horse shuffled beneath her, and Yasna wished for a litter, for she had little experience with riding. The army waited with barely contained vigor. Perhaps that was the reason for her unsettlement. Before, her strategies had always been given at others' behest. They had been the ones venturing men's lives, and ultimately the guilt of failure had been theirs to bear. That was it. She had gathered these men, and for the first time the responsibility of their lives was hers. Meridas insisted on controlling battle command, and Taln's was the banner under which they rode. But they were Yasna's men. They would die because she had brought them here. Her horse stirred, and a sudden touch on her leg made her jump. She looked down to find Kemnar and Brother Lon standing beside her. Had she been that distracted? "I'm sorry it took us so long, Lady Yasna," Kemnar said, nodding for Lon to produce a sheet of paper, scribbled with lines of text. "But here it is, a list of the commands Meridas and Aniezer made over the last few days, with the more unusual ones listed at the top." Yasna took the proffered sheet, noting the spear Lon carried in his other hand. She held up the sheet, scanning the list as she spoke. "Brother Lon, you are not to take part in the battle." "Excuse me?" the monk asked. "You will withdraw to the command tent," Yasna said. "You are one of a few people in this force who can read, and I am not going to let you die on that battlefield." Lon glanced away with bitter eyes. "Well," he said, "my streak for proving myself useless continues unabated. Thank you, my lady. One wouldn't wish to break such a delightful streak of laziness. I suppose I'll go find a place to nap while everyone else dies." "You have too much knowledge and training, Lon," Yasna said. "Regardless of your newfound desire to be heroic, you cannot be risked. Do as I command." Lon sighed, then stalked off. For the first time, Yasna remarked on how young he was. Barely 20, if that old. His monk's robes, mixed with his strange ability to see to the truth of a person's soul, made him seem far older. Kemnar bowed and retreated to the battle preparations. Yasna let them both leave, turning to scan the list they had worked to prepare. What had she expected to find? There had to be some clue to Meridas's plans, manifest in his orders. Whatever his schemes, He could hardly actuate them without giving commands. Most of the list was unremarkable. Squads had been assigned to separate camp duties. Changes had been made in personnel groupings to better mix the untrained with the skilled. Men had been sent to hunt for food supplies to supplement what the Awakener created. Meridas had made orders as to how the tents were to be arranged and who was to pack them each day. Once again, Yasna remarked on what she had noticed so long ago. When Meridas had first taken command of that first 100 men from Marcabe, he had displayed far more knowledge about the workings of an army than a simple merchant should possess. There wasn't much on the list that was of any interest. She almost tossed it away before she made the connection. Meridas had made many orders about troop locations for the upcoming battle, obviously intentioned on placing Aniazer's better-trained soldiers in key positions. One of those changes, though unremarkable at first glance, suddenly gave her a chill of realization. Meridas had replaced Taln's inexperienced honor guard with men from Aniazer's own personal guard. Yasna recognized some of the names as Aniazer's most loyal and well-trained soldiers. Ostensibly, it was a sign of respect for Taln, putting the herald under the protection of the finest soldiers in the army. Yasna saw the truth. She remembered vividly the jealousy in Meridas's eyes and his conspiratory familiarity with Aniazer. Taln would not survive the battle. I have to warn him. Thankful for an excuse to leave the horse behind, Yasna slid out of her saddle and went looking for the madman. She found him sitting alone, close to the front of the army, yet somehow apart from them. He looked up when she approached, and she could see something in his eyes. Resolve. For ill or gain, he had made his decision. A sudden panic struck her. She had hoped that he would wait, at least until the battle was over, to decide. Now she realized that was not possible. He had delayed as long as his conscience would allow, but the scouts would return within the hour. After that, it was to battle, and he would either stay with certainty in his heraldship or go with his madness honestly declared. If he did expose himself, the men would have to ride into battle with an uncertain morale, having just listened to their leader swear himself a madman. He could yet destroy their army before the enemy had a chance to strike. Taln's eyes were grim. Was that because he had finally realized the depth of his fantasies? Or, instead, was it because he knew she would be disappointed in his decision to remain a herald? Yasna wished sharply that she had never brought this decision before him. She paused a short distance from his stone perch, and he stood. He still refused to wear plate, though he bore his shard blade in a calm grip. He had traded his noble sea-silk cloak for the simple brown one he had been given in the monastery. What did that mean? "You are in danger," she said quickly. "Meridas has replaced your honor guard. I'm afraid he intends you to suffer an accident on the battlefield." Taln snorted. "Meridas is the least of my problems at the moment," he said, waving his hand dismissively. He stood quietly for a moment, eyes distracted. Then he looked right at her, eyes decisive. He began, but didn't get beyond that first word before Yasna interrupted. "Don't speak," she pled. "I don't want to hear what you have decided." Taln paused. Then he frowned. "What game do you play, woman?" "No game," Yasna promised. Oh, Taln, I had no right to ask you to betray yourself. This is who you are. Even if your memories are false, they are what give you life." "Perhaps you had no right to ask the question," Taln said. But you certainly have no right to make the decision for me, Yasna. Let me speak my piece." "I can't," Yasna said. "It's not a decision you should have to make. At least give it more thought." "I have put it off long enough," Taln said with a shake of his head. He looked down at her with those solemn brown eyes of his. "You realize that, either way, I cannot lead this army any longer. As a herald, I must leave you here. As a man, I must step down from my position of lies. Either way, I will not ride to battle at the head of the herald's army." And without him, it would fall. Even as he spoke, a plan occurred to Yasna, though she cursed herself for it. "Must everything be a deal to you, Yasna?" She had told him yes, and for once she had spoken with complete honesty. "Those aren't the only two options, Taln," she said. "As a herald, you could ride with us, then reap the benefits of a befriended nation." Taln shook his head. "That is what you offered before, but it isn't enough. I would need more than just a friendly kingdom, Yasna. I would need a nation that believed in me." "And you would have it," Yasna said. "I vow to you, Talanel, help me fight off the invaders that threaten my kingdom, and I will see that you have whatever resources you need. I will profess you a herald with my loudest voice, and build you allies amongst the courts of Roshar. You say the storm shades will come in 1 year. I give my oath that when this invasion is repelled and Alethkar is safe, our nation will prepare for the return as if what you say were true. We will train our armies as you prescribe. We will stockpile and plan. We will listen to your preachings and we will obey. If your demons do attack Roshar, then they will at least find one kingdom ready for them." Taln listened to the speech, the confusion in his eyes shining again. His frown deepened. "Your king would honor this vow?" "I don't know," she confessed. "But my uncle, Lord Dalinar Kholin, will. Even if he doesn't hold the crown when we return, he is a powerful man, even more powerful than my brother. You'd like him, Taln. He's a lot like you, a little stuffy and incorrigibly proper, but honest and good. I promise you, he will honor my vow." Taln fell silent, considering. His grip on the shard blade tightened unconsciously. "You have a sure talent, Yasna. Whenever I think I see clearly, you can make smoke to dim my understanding." "Smoke. Onyx." He looked into her eyes. "Do you always get what you wish?" "Usually," Yasna admitted, "though I have often regretted wanting the wrong things, especially recently." "A herald cannot be a man, Yasna," he said quietly. "If this is who I am to be, then I will live it as best I can. No more questioning. I will be a herald, and you must understand what that means. Heralds are above the regular concerns of men." "I understand," Yasna replied softly, trying to keep things from breaking inside. She had to remain strong. "I would rather know you as Talanel the Herald than be with you as Taln the broken madman." Their eyes locked and lingered, something unspoken passing between them. She would never know his answer. She would never know whether or not he had been willing to give up everything he was in order to be with her. With shame, she admitted that she would also never truly know whether she had forbidden him to decide for his own good, or simply because she wanted to keep the army together. Taln dropped to one knee, driving his blade into the rock. He bowed his head before her in an oddly humbling gesture. "Thank you," he whispered. Then he stood, strong-backed and sure again. Talinel the Steadfast, a herald determined to protect Roshar from the demons of its mystic past. Jasnah watched him go, something unacknowledged crumbling within her. If only she could do as he did, abandon reason in favor of fantasy. What would it be like to ignore the harsh truths of the world, replacing them with beliefs far more palatable? But she could not. Whatever it was within her that placed logic over fancy and truth over delusion was also the thing that gave her strength. She would rather find success in the real world than have all the pretend treasures of Taln's false one. "It's gone," she realized, somewhat stunned. "It's over. I never deserved him anyway." And she knew then what she had to do. Distasteful, yes, but necessary. Someone had to be practical, even if practicality brought pain. She was accustomed to that. She found Meridas going over his battle orders with Aniezer and some of their officers. Kemnar was there, as were all the shard-bearers. This was not a time for political bickering, and even Meridas could see that. Jasnah stood quietly, close enough to be noticed, but not close enough to be intrusive. She watched Meridas with a calm look, catching his eyes. A few moments later he excused himself to walk over to her. When he arrived, his eyes were curious, and he spoke no insults. He obviously sensed a change in her. "Yes?" he asked quietly. "You plan to have Taln killed," Jasnah said calmly. "Do not try to deny it. You replaced his honor guard, and I see the hatred in your eyes when you see him. You loathe that this is his army, and you hate how he looks at me." Meridas's eyes thinned. "You wish me to return his honor guard to the way it was before?" "It would do little good," Jasnah said. "You are a resourceful man, Meridas. I do not doubt that you will find a way to remove Taln sooner or later. I do wonder how you intend to keep the army together without him, however." Meridas raised an eyebrow. "You overestimate his worth, my dear. If our illustrious herald were to fall to an enemy blade today, the army would not suffer grievously. We need him at the beginning of the battle, true, lest the men break during the initial assault. However, once the battle is through, we will have the resources of Kholinar. That means pay for the men and promises of titles for the officers. I think you will find that worldly rewards will replace spiritual ones quite nicely for the great percentage of the troops." Jasnah frowned. "It appears that we have need to deal. The madman must live. The cost matters not, Meridas, as long as you see that he is not harmed." Meridas snorted, eyes flashing with jealousy. "What?" he demanded in a quiet hiss. "I am to make certain your lover remains, so that you can bed him behind my back? You would marry me, true, but only to make a fool of me before the court." Jasnah regarded him flatly. "Taln is bound by an honor beyond what you can understand, Meridas," she said. "He would do no such thing. You have my oath of honor." He calmed, eyeing her distrustfully. Yet there was enough decency in him not to question her word. "You wish an accord?" he asked. "Very well. You have only one thing to offer. It will happen in Kholinar this evening, after we defeat the enemy force. No more complaints, no more evasions, and no more deals. You are far too proficient at promising the same thing over and over for greater rewards. This evening we will wed." "Agreed," Jasnah said, feeling a coldness within. "I will take your hand, Meridas, but there shall be no heirs until this war is finished, with Taln still alive." Meridas's expression darkened. "Very well, but I add my own stipulations. First, I will be free of my oath. No more obedience to your commands. Second, should the madman die from actions beyond my control, you will provide an heir once the war is through. I am to trust his life to your generosity?" Yasna asked. "You are to trust it to my word," Meridas spat. "I will not kill your beloved, Yasna. As long as you don't make a fool of me in court, I care nothing for his life. Warfare, however, is unpredictable, as you well know. I will not have my future dependent upon a madman's ability to keep himself from harm. I will see that he is protected as best I can. Should something unforeseen happen, however, well, you are a woman of great resources. I'm certain you will be able to determine that I had nothing to do with the death. I give my oath that he will not die by my hand or intention. I will give my allies the same command." He would offer no more. Yasna closed her eyes and nodded. When she opened them, Meridas bowed slightly, then returned to his plannings.
Chapter 77. Taln 13. As Taln suspected, Yasna was wrong about Meridas's intentions. The nobleman's soldiers didn't try to kill Taln. In fact, they were frustratingly overprotective. Taln stood, ringed by a double line of Aniezer's best troops, fuming at his inability to take part in the battle. Even Meridas and Aniezer themselves weren't so well coddled. It was probably a subtle insult of some kind. That would be like Meridas, keeping Taln from the fighting out of a supposed wish to protect him. Still, there was good reason to place Taln where he was. His honor guard stood at the top of a hill, his banner, gold with a brown Taln glyph, flying to reassure and give strength. He would have placed his troop in the middle of the battlefield, where it would lend even greater morale, but he was more confident in his ability to keep himself alive than any mortal man would have a right to be. Any mortal man. He was a herald. The only things he had were his memories, and they had served him well so far. Denying who he was would present far too great a risk. If he held to his memories, the only thing he risked losing was Yasna. If he abandoned them, he risked the future of mankind. It was good that Yasna understood that. Besides, the solution she had presented was a very good one. He didn't gamble much, not really. A year was not so long to wait. If the Kochen did not invade, then he could revisit his personal searchings. If they did attack, then all of Roshar would have been better because of his determination. It was a very good compromise. Yasna's battle plan worked well, too. Either the Aleth forces had tried before to get a breaking force into the castle, or the Vadens were expecting such a move, for they reacted with remarkable speed once the diversionary force was spotted. The invaders gathered their ranks, moving carefully into intercepting positions without exposing themselves to much bow fire from the walls. Fortunately, their speed and positioning left their towers behind and exposed their forces to an easy ambush. Meridas might not have approved of the plan's origin, but he made use of it with finesse. Within a few 10-set minutes of the call to attack, the Vaden forces were surrounded on 3 sides. The towers fell quickly, captured rather than destroyed. From his vantage, Taln could easily see the workings of the battle. Both armies were only of moderate size. Much of what he saw unsettled him. The Aleth shard-bearers were by far the central forces on the battlefield. The Aleth spearmen, trained carefully in their formations, worked at positioning the enemy troops. The shard-bearers were the ones who caused the most destruction. With proper support, a single shard-bearer could break an enemy formation, leaving 10 sets of corpses before him. The spearmen could then move in, decimating the fallen line. Where resistance was stronger, the shard-bearers simply slew more men. The twin edges of ambush and shard blades proved overwhelming. Taln couldn't see faces below, but he could feel the panic in the movement of the Vaden lines. Even without Taln, the Aleth force still had 14 shard-bearers, an incredible number. Soon, Vaden dead covered the ground, and Taln felt less displeased about being left behind. His presence was needed in this battle, but his blade certainly was not, and the slaughter did not make for an appealing temptation. This is what his brethren had feared, shard blades turned against men. This was one of the reasons prohibitions against conquering and fighting other men had been placed in both the arguments and the Way of Kings. The heralds had suffered men to have shard blades because of the weapon's awesome effectiveness against the Kothan. Obviously, blades were even more effective against men. Meridas himself dueled the Vaden commander. The bout was short, and once the man fell, his sub-commanders were within their honor to surrender, which they quickly did. The Vadens had lost nearly half of their force in a matter of a couple of hours. Taln stomached the destruction, as he had so many other times. Time had done odd things to his perceptions of death. He had seen so many people pass, mighty lords and simple farmers, scholars and tyrants. Yet time had not dulled his concern for them. Indeed, their lives were the whole of his purpose. He fought through the eternities to protect them, and loathed seeing their lives spent so easily. "Come," he said to his unwanted honor guard, riding down toward the battlefield. He could already see the gates opening again, the besieged Aleth nobility coming out to greet their saviors. Taln shunned their fanfares, turning away as Meridas rode proudly toward a group of well-clothed aristocrats. "My lord," one of his guard captains asked as Taln led them away from the gates toward the battlefield itself, "should you not present yourself to those inside the walls?" "Later," Taln said, climbing off of his horse as they neared the area that had seen the most fighting. The groans of men were low in the air, as if the sounds themselves were weak and dying. Most of the living wounded bore the mangled wounds of spearheads rammed under or past armor. Of the men hit with shard blades, there were few in one piece, let alone alive. Tired soldiers moved among the carnage, searching out the survivors. "We did not fight," Taln told his men, "so we can use our strength for this effort. Help me find the wounded and tend to their injuries." Mouths turned down at the prospect of doing such menial, grisly work, but Taln's orders left little room for complaint. Reluctantly, the honor guard followed him across the blood-stained rocks, while their fellow officers rode into Kholinar to feast. It was dark before Taln finally released his soldiers from their task. Bloodied and weary, the 20 men probably wished they were among the wounded themselves. Taln sighed, laying one final soldier down in the healer's tent. Aniezer's force was weak on healers and attendants for the sick, but Lord Dalinar's betrothed had sent men from the city to see to the work. And there was much to be done. It was surprising how tenaciously a man could grip life, how long he could lay among the dead, whispering for help through strength-sapped lips. Taln did what he could. He understood the body as only one who had used the Na'el to heal could. He was no surgeon. His understanding was instinctual, rather than specific. However, he had lived a very, very long time, and had acquired many skills over the centuries. He put to use what he had, training his men quickly and helping the healers by moving bodies and bandaging wounds. Taln stood wearily. There was still work to be done, but it would have to be someone else's duty. Taln had avoided his political responsibilities long enough. If he was going to prepare Alethkar, as Yasna's oath said he could, then he was going to need to keep up at least some proprieties. He left the tent behind, promising to send soldiers to help move the wounded, those who survived the night, inside the walls the next day, before a high storm could drench them. He left the lighted tents behind, the fresh, unbloodied air outside strange to his senses. The great city of Kholinar glowed with triumphant torches on the walls. Taln paused for a moment, staring up. The celebrations seemed odd compared to the suffering he had left behind, but he knew they were necessary. Victory must be encouraged, the men rewarded, for they were still an uncertain and untried force. A quick success now would give them a great deal of motivation. Kholinar. It looked old. Not broken or unkempt, its walls were still as sure as they had been centuries before. Yet there was something to the massive city. It looked as Taln felt. Aged without wrinkles, tired without frailty. Some things from the past, at least, lived on. This was Bajordan's city, and here he had learned philosophy and truth from the lips of Jezrien, Ishar, and Beliar, the wisest of the heralds. From his discussions with them, especially Jezrien, had come the grand work, the way of kings. Yes, some things did endure. There was goodness in men, though oft-times their foolishness overrode it. Taln entered the city without fanfare or recognition. Dressed in his common cloak, his clothing stained dark with the blood of the wounded, he might seem like just another wearied soldier who had drawn the unpleasant duty of seeing to the wounded. The streets were busy with people. Some soldiers, the majority civilians. Apparently Lord Dalinar's call to arms had been very well received, and most of the city's men had gone with him to battle against their king. The revelers gave him wide berth, noting both his mood and his clothing. He made his way to the palace. The way was sure to him, even if much of the cityscape had changed over the centuries. At the palace gates, a pair of guards moved to bar him entrance, but Taln hefted his shard blade off his shoulder and presented it mutely. The soldiers quickly flushed at their mistake, bowing. The palace was well maintained. Rich indeed, but not as gaudy as the one at Ral Aram. Taln was beginning to suspect that he would indeed like this Dalinar, as Yasna had implied. The palace hallways were busy with servants bearing the remnants of the evening feast, and Taln's stomach, that shouldn't need food, growled hungrily. He ignored its protests for the moment, following the flow of people toward the main feast hall. The room was oddly quiet. He turned the corner, expecting to see people sitting at their segregated tables, lethargically drinking away the end of the feast. Instead, he found a solemn gathering. The nobility were seated quietly at their tables as they watched something at the front of the room. Meridas stood, wearing what appeared to be a new outfit, before the kneeling Yasna. Her dress was a deep blue, not as ornate as the one in which she had escaped from the palace, but gossamer and beautiful nonetheless. Her hair was done up in one of her traditional Aleth braids, her face properly made up, her head bowed as she listened to the Vorin monk preach. It had been a long time, but the Vorin ceremonies had been fairly immutable since the 8th epoch. Taln recognized the wedding quite easily. He stood, stunned, simply staring. "We've reached civilization now," he realized after a moment's stupefaction. "She was engaged to Meridas. Now that a proper ceremony can be performed." That was why she had approached him earlier. That was why she had been so impatient that he make a choice between herald and man. Taln had thought her solution of waiting a year a simple delay, but it had been more than that. Without a promise from him, she would do what was expected of her. Considering her dedication to Alethkar, it was amazing she would even consider otherwise. Suddenly he realized that he wasn't the only one who had been forced to consider abandoning everything that he was. He wanted to look away, but he could not. Heralds were not supposed to feel like such fools. They were supposed to be immune to such pain in their hearts. They were supposed to be perfect, not prone to foolish sentimentality.
or love. But he had never made a very good herald. Yasna reached up and took Meridas's hand, and the room's men cheered while the women nodded to each other approvingly. Yasna stood. It was over. She was married. And Taln understood that he had allowed something very, very precious to blow away with the wind.
Chapter 78 Dalinar 8 Despair killed as many of Dalinar's men as did skirmishes with the Vaden army. They simply gave up, sitting down or collapsing against the stone, knowing that their companions couldn't pause long enough to encourage them onward. Even those who kept going seemed to have lost heart. They knew that they marched toward their doom. A final stand at Teth-Kanar would be no more meaningful to them than a final stand on the empty plains. They would die either way, and their country would fall to the invaders. Perhaps this is how the soldiers of Pralir felt during those last months, Dalinar thought as he urged the men forward, giving encouragement where he could. Behind him, Elokar's army provided cover. The Vadens had gotten too close again, and one of the armies had needed to provide time for the other to retreat. After the disastrous ambush several weeks before, both leaders had determined that there would be no more joint ventures. Dalinar reined his horse in as he reached the lip of the rift of Northall. Too wide and steep-sided to be a late, the rift was a massive crack in the ground. Dalinar loathed using it as a pathway, for it would provide his enemies with the high ground, not to mention an easy trail to follow. However, at the army's current rate, there wouldn't be enough men to fight even if they did reach Teth-Kanar. The bed of the rift was a steady decline, far easier to march along than farmland hills. It also provided a direct path to the Teth Late. Taking the rift would cut as much as a week off their march. The Aleth army's situation was too dire for caution. They would have to risk danger from above. Dalinar pulled his horse back, watching the curving line of his forces pass him and begin down the decline. Fortunately, the side of the rift sloped here, allowing for the army to move down. The natural stone ramp was narrow enough that the column of men bunched up somewhat at the lip, waiting their turn to begin downward, but it was wide enough to be manageable. Dalinar remained where he was, mounted, his shard plate's scars hidden by the darkening dusk sky. Hopefully, the sight of him sitting confidently would give the men strength. Unfortunately, Dalinar had trouble persuading himself to be anything but pessimistic regarding the army's chances. He had worked through every version of the Teth-Kanar battle he could envision, and they all ended with his defeat. His army was too fractured, its men too despondent, and the enemy was just too strong. He kept trying to convince himself that the Almighty would see them to victory, but he wondered. What had Alethkar done to deserve deliverance? Conquer Pralir? Bicker with itself, forcing its soldiers to fight brother against brother? Perhaps Alethkar had already been judged, and the Vaden army was a form of divine retribution. An hour passed as his army moved down the ramp, but Elokar held off the Vadens long enough. Barely. The king's withdrawing forces began to arrive at the ramp just as the last of Dalinar's army was reaching the bottom of the rift. Dalinar saluted the shard-bearer at the head of Elokar's troop, then urged his horse down the rift, leaving the king to his fate. If the withdrawal were handled poorly, the Vadens would box Elokar up against the side of the rift, and his army would be slaughtered. The bottom of the rift lay in shadow. Dalinar wanted to call camp for the evening, but he couldn't risk stopping where the Vaden forces could attack so easily from above. He gave the order to continue marching, moving his men away from the base of the ramp to make room for Elokar's forces. He rode with his men, urging them onward. They seemed so few now, barely 10,000. He had to work to keep the despair out of his voice as he gave his orders. After he was certain they were on their way, he left Chothan in command and rode back to check on Elokar's progress. Even as he approached, he could see that something was wrong. Elokar's army had reached the bottom of the rift safely, and there appeared to be no pursuit from above. At first, Dalinar was confused as to what had prompted his initial feeling of wrongness. He called halt to his honor guard, holding up a hand and staring ahead with a frown. And then he saw it. The ramp was gone, or at least half of it was. If he missed his guess, the other half would soon follow. Dalinar cursed, kicking his horse into motion, forcing his honor guard to break into a marching jog to keep up. He rounded Elhokar's forces, making for the ramp. The king himself, golden armor stained red from the fighting above, stood at the base of the ramp. However, he was not the source of Dalinar's attention. A group of figures stood on the ramp, their forms barely lit by the evening light. Light flashed before them, crystalline, refracted light. The figures wore black.
"What are you doing here?"
Dalinar demanded, throwing himself off of his horse and stalking toward Elhokar. The king turned. He bore a wound on the bottom of his cheek, probably from a spear thrust, and his eyes gave Dalinar pause. He hadn't seen the boy since their meeting weeks before, beneath the tent of parley outside Crossguard. There was something different about Elhokar. The same youthful arrogance remained, but there was a hardness that hadn't been there before.
"I'm doing what must be done, uncle," Elhokar said. "You are using Awakeners in combat," Dalinar yelled, waving toward the forms above. "Have you no sense of honor or propriety?"
"Have you no love for your men?" Elhokar snapped. "Is your storm-cursed honor more valuable to you than they are? Besides, this isn't combat. The fighting ended an hour ago. I'm just making certain our people have half a chance traveling down this death trap of a chasm. This ramp is the only way down on this side for miles."
Light flashed from above, a chunk of rock changing from stone to fire, then vanishing. A column of smoke was rising in the dark sky as well. The Awakeners would be using all three destruction essences: fire, air, and smoke. Dalinar shivered. Besides, during his Charan, he had only seen Awakeners perform their art twice, and both times it had been by accident. A perpetual glow hung before the creatures as they called forth the power of their gems, then released their fury upon the stone rampway. They worked incredibly fast, remaking thousands of brickweights of stone in a matter of a few minutes. Dalinar turned back to the king. Perhaps the boy was right, but Dalinar wasn't in the mood to admit so. Elhokar's frustrating refusal to work with him over the last few weeks had worn down barriers of patience.
"You should have consulted me," Dalinar said.
"Why?" Elhokar spat back. "I am still king, uncle, despite your little proclamation back at Crossguard. I rule Alethkar, and your armies travel here by my choice. Be glad I haven't ordered you executed yet."
"You may be king in name, boy," Dalinar said, "but you have never been king in my heart, nor have you been one in the hearts of your people. They can remember a time when a true man held the throne. The man you might resemble, but the king you will never be. How Nolanarin birthed such an idiot of a son I will never know."
"Begone!" Elhokar shouted, his face red. Smoke formed in his hand as he pointed, his shard blade coming to life. Dalinar gritted his teeth, then spun and marched toward his horse. As he walked, he couldn't help but notice the faces of those around him. His honor guard and Elhokar's, regular soldiers from the force and servants carrying supplies had all stopped to watch the exchange. Their eyes were haunted as they watched Dalinar mount up and ride away. Chapter 79. Jack 12. Jack Sansan Villano, truthless of Shinovar, shook his head to himself. For a people with a supposed warrior tradition, the Vaden nobleman certainly found a good number of reasons to avoid entering combat personally. Perhaps it was just his company. Ilhadal Devar, despite all his boisterousness, obviously had very little actual combat experience. A lifetime of sycophantry had not prepared him for the demands of high-level leadership, especially of the martial variety.
He was obviously relieved when Oven made few overt moves to enter the fighting, for it allowed Ilhadal himself to remain back as well. The idiot king was probably restrained more by practicality than by fear. His philosophy of leadership demanded that he keep himself from danger, for if he fell or were seriously wounded, the men would have no one to look to for strength. As a result, Oven stayed near the fighting, but rarely entered himself, and when he did attack, he always struck against demoralized groups of light infantry, making a great show of cutting down the poor men with his shard blade. Most of the time, however, Oven simply rode behind the ranks, presenting the perfect image of an inspiring king at war, giving his men encouragement. Not that they needed it. Jek scanned the battlefield, which was scattered with relatively few bodies. The Aleth forces had fled again, as expected. Though Oven pushed his forces hard to follow, he was having a great deal of trouble cornering the Aleths. His force was not only larger, but he was in hostile, unfamiliar territory. He couldn't afford to be as frantic in his movement as Elokar's forces. The idiot king was obviously annoyed with the continued harrying. Jek moved his horse up beside Oven's, studying the king's face. The day's battle had been a quick one, barely even worth stopping. The Aleths had disengaged shortly after the fighting began, a move that had cost them a number of losses. "Why did they do it?" Jek asked, after catching the king's attention. Oven shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "Dalinar and Elokar struggle against one another for leadership of the armies. This smacks of the king's impetuousness rather than Dalinar's caution. Elokar thinks himself a clever man. It's probably some kind of trick or delaying tactic." Jek nodded, glancing to the side as Ilhadal Davar rode up on a fine stallion, too fine, in fact. An old Shin adage said, "Never ride a horse better bred than yourself, lest men wonder if you should be carrying it instead." The house leader, of course, had seen no combat, not that there had been much time for him to have done so, had he been inclined. "This is your fault, Vedanel," Ilhadal announced as his horse pulled up. Oven raised an eyebrow. Behind him, soldiers picked through the field, ending the lives of any living Aleths and calling for the healers when they found a Vaden survivor. "My fault?" Oven asked. "I am not the one who ordered the Aleths to retreat again." "We wouldn't have this problem if you had waited to attack Crossguard," Ilhadal announced, as if he had suddenly become a master of tactics. At least his shard plate, bronze in color and ornamented with engraved stallions, hid his age-fattened body and drooping muscles. "Waiting another day would have done nothing, Davar," Oven said. "If Dalinar or Elokar had won decisively before we attacked, we'd only be fighting a smaller force, which would make them even more difficult to follow." Ilhadal snorted in reply, but he did not argue. Oven turned northeast, scanning the terrain. Dusk was approaching, however, and it was growing increasingly difficult to make out distant forms in the darkness. Even if it had been light, there probably wouldn't have been much to see. The scouts said that the land sloped downward ahead of them, into a chasm that wasn't quite a lake. The Aleth forces must have found a pathway down. That would leave them vulnerable, however, with the Vadens on the high ground above. Oven turned his horse to the south, toward where the men were setting up evening camp. He kicked his horse into a trot, not bothering to bid Ilhadal farewell or order Jek to follow. "They're probably marching through the night," Oven decided. "A desperate move. Their current pace already forces them to abandon the wounded and the weak. By marching all night, they will lose even more men to fatigue. But where are they going? Cardanar would provide safety, but it is a good distance away. Palinor is the best fortified in the area, but it was probably depleted of troops long ago. Tethkanar? It has ships, and Elokar could flee. But how would he have been able to persuade Dalinar to go along with such a plan?" The king paced slowly in his tense main chamber. Oven obviously didn't want any interjections from Jack. The few comments Jack had tried to make had been ignored. Balinmar sat on the other side of the room, content in his thoughts. The old adviser didn't seem concerned about the king's state of mind. However, he rarely seemed to care very much about Oven's mood.
"The seers still see very little," Oven continued, "and some of the generals are beginning to wonder if that idiot Ilhadal is right. They think that the Aleths must be leading us along some elaborate trap."
Jack frowned. The disappearance of the girl Shinri had produced a quite unexpected effect on Oven. He seemed more unstable, less in control than he once had been. Her disappearance seemed like such a small failure, but it obviously meant far more to Oven. During the last few weeks, the king had become prone to pacing and mumbling as he did now, trying to vocally work through problems that he had once solved in his head.
"If only they would have their minstrels play. I would know their feelings, perhaps know which of the two truly leads. It's like they cannot decide themselves, and they take turns making decisions."
A knock came from the entrance post outside, but of course Oven couldn't hear it. Jack had to get the king's attention, pointing at the tent flaps as the knock came again.
"Come in,"
Oven ordered, pausing in his walkings. "My lord," a guard said, poking his head in the flap, "a messenger has arrived. He says his message is important."
"Show him in,"
Oven said with a wave of his hand. The messenger entered shortly, then went to one knee before his king. "My lord," the messenger said eagerly, "I have just come from the city of Ramvar, on the eastern coast of Alethkar. We have made contact with the Loch and Run fleet. They say that they are on course, and that there were no problems with their launch." Oven paused, then took a deep breath and nodded.
"Good. Go deliver the same message to each of the first generals in the army, then finally to Ilhadal Davar."
The messenger nodded, then retreated. As he left, the same guard from before poked his head into the tent again. This time his face was confused. "My lord," he said, "I apologize for bothering you again, but it appears that you have a visitor." Oven frowned.
"Who?"
The guard parted the flaps, and a red-haired woman strode into the room. She wore a deep brown cloak, tied closed as if to hide her in the night, and held a young boy in her arms. There was something familiar about her features.
"Nanava,"
Oven said with stupefaction.
"What are you doing here?"
"Avi?"
the woman asked, looking at him with amazed eyes.
"It is you. They said that blessed be the Almighty."
Nanava Kolin, Oven's sister, Elokar's wife. This isn't good, Jack thought with a foreboding feeling.
"You should not have come here, Nanava," Oven said slowly.
"And why not?" the woman said. "Avi, someone had to come speak with you. Invading Alethkar? We're your allies. Who convinced you to do this thing?"
Oven didn't answer, his face troubled. Across the room, Balinmar leaned forward with interest, and Nanava finally noticed the old man.
"You!" she said with shock. "What is the meaning of this?"
She paused, looking from Balinmar to Oven, eyes widening slightly. Balinmar chuckled.
"No, child. I'm not the one who convinced your brother to attack. He made that decision quite pleasantly on his own. I'm simply here in an advisory capacity."
"Traitor!"
Nanava said. Balinmar shrugged.
"I wouldn't be quite so accusatory, my dear. If you were simply coming to plead for your brother to cease his attack, why did you bring your son with you? Could it be that someone feared she was on the losing side and decided to defect?"
Nanava covered her embarrassment with the customary skill of a Kanaran noblewoman. She did not, however, deny Balinmar's accusation.
"The army was moving too quickly," she finally said, "and I was slowing them. I came to plead the bond of kinship and ask for protection and passage to Vadenar."
A politically practical move, Jack thought.
Very much a Kanaran, noble woman.
Leave us, Oven said quietly, waving to the guard. Nanava looked up, her political visage melting slightly as she regarded her brother.
"Oh, Avi," she said, "how you've changed! It's a miracle, truly."
She reached out, cradling the sleeping boy in one arm, brushing Oven's cheek with the other. You always did treat me differently, Oven said. The others were so cruel. But you sang to me. When I could still hear, if only a little. You would sing, and those are the only songs I can still remember. The only things I can still hear. Nanava smiled.
"I remember," she said.
Oven shook his head. I killed them, Nanava. She frowned.
"Who?"
Our brothers, Oven said with a quiet sigh. All 4 of them. I killed them one at a time when everyone thought me an idiot. Nanava.
"No, Avi, you didn't do that. They died by accidents."
Oven shook his head. The more suspicious elements in court assumed it was Karathach, of course, especially when I let him assume command when I came to the throne. No one suspected me. Poor, dim-witted Oven, a pawn in the Vaden court, a man thought a fool simply because he lost his hearing as a child and didn't learn to speak when he should have. Nanava didn't notice the curling line of smoke around Oven's hand. You shouldn't have come, Oven repeated. Do you realize that when I take Alethkar, the old king's wife and son will be the greatest threat to my throne? Nanava looked too shocked to reply.
"But, Avi," she said, "you speak nonsense. Who is telling you these things? Let us speak to them. You don't have to listen to what they say. You're king."
Yes, Oven said. I am king. He stared at her for a brief moment, a deep sadness showing in his eyes. I remember those songs still, Nanava. Sweet, beautiful, like a songbird. Oven looked up, glancing toward Balinmar, then Jack, then at the door. Neither man needed further prompting. This was one task Oven would perform with his own hands. When Jack returned, he found Oven sitting quietly between 2 bodies. There had been very little screaming. Even at the end, the woman hadn't really understood what was happening. Even sharp political minds often had trouble seeing past familial prejudices. Oven looked up at Jack's entry. Jack had expected to see grief, even madness, in Oven's eyes. He was not prepared to face calm coolness instead. Oven stood. The Aleth forces are traveling to Teth Kanar, he said firmly. Jack looked up from the gruesome corpses of Nanava and her son. You're certain? Oven nodded sharply. I can see it in their movements. Teth Kanar is the largest city in this region and will have soldiers and gemstones to lend. Its lord Intara Teth is a sot. Like Dalinar, he refused to join with either Elokar or Jezenrosh. But he also refused Dalinar's call to arms. He would probably just squat in his keep forever and let the kingdom fall around him, content to his parties and his grief. But he won't be able to ignore his countrymen if they arrive in such a state. Jack frowned at the change in Oven's demeanor. The king was certain again, in control. Clean this up, Oven said, stepping over the body of his sister without looking down. Make certain no one discovers what happened here. It wouldn't be good for morale. With that, he left the tent. Jack stood in the stillness. For the first time, he realized that the chest in the back of the room was open. He approached and found the cage inside was now empty. The last 2 birds lay dead at the cage bottom. Their necks snapped with a quick, efficient hand. Oven had no birds left. Jack looked up, staring after the king, wondering what the move meant.
He killed his sister, the only person I've ever seen him show affection for.
Perhaps what Jack had seen in Oven earlier, the indecisiveness, the emotion, was not madness. Maybe it had simply been humanity. And it was gone now. Oven had become the perfect leader he had spoken of, a man free from conscience. He had no room for love, guilt, or sorrow. He had already destroyed everything that could have produced any of the three.